Hello everyone, and welcome back to Down Periscope, Up Periscope. I'm Tim, your host, and welcome to the USS Blueback. So this will be an extremely in-depth version of the normal tour that I give, and this is also a redo of a previous video I made, which is meant to correct a number of deficiencies and inaccuracies in that video. So here we are on the OMSI waterfront, where Blueback is permanently moored. And we're gonna head over here and I'm gonna start talking about the outside of the submarine. Now, Blueback here is one of 3 Barbel-class submarines constructed. The other 2 were USS Barbel, SS-580, and the USS Bonefish, SS-582. The Barbel-class were actually the first production attack submarines in the United States Navy to feature what is known as the teardrop-shaped hull, also known as the albacore hull, which was developed from the experimental USS Albacore. Now, the hull shape of these submarines made them much faster, quieter, and more hydrodynamically efficient underwater than previous submarines. All 3 Barbels, or B-Girls as they're often called, were commissioned in 1959. Blueback herself was built at Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Construction began in 1957. 2 years and $21 million later, or over $233 million today, she was commissioned into service. Blueback herself would spend 31 years in the U.S. Navy until she was decommissioned in 1990, becoming the U.S. Navy's last diesel-electric attack submarine. Now, with the exception of USS Dolphin, which was actually just a research submarine decommissioned in 2007, all the combat submarines in the U.S. Navy after the Barbel class are nuclear-powered. Now, this large square structure on top of the submarine with the 581 is known as the sail because it kind of looks like one. But as you can imagine, this submarine has no interest in wind power. Now, at the front of the sail up there is the bridge, which is accessible via an access trunk at the front of the sail, and that's where they would con the boat when it's on the surface. But unlike older World War II fleet boats, this is not a conning tower because there's no pressure hull inside that structure. It's not a habitable space. The only purpose of the sail actually is to house all of those masts that are sticking up out of the top of it. So the 2 skinny silver tubes up there that kind of look like big crochet hooks, those are the periscopes. The black spotted masts are various antennas for communications, navigation, ECM, etc. And the big black mast on the back is our snorkel. The top of it is the air induction, and about halfway down it you see that plate known as the bat wings. That's for the diesel exhaust to come out. So that would be just below the surface of the water to expel the diesel exhaust into the water so we're not sucking it back into the snorkel intake or leaving a trail of diesel smoke behind us. Now, all of those masts up there, including the snorkel, retract down into the sail when the submarine is underwater. On the back of the sail, you'll notice there's kind of a small window there. That's actually for a rearward-facing navigation light when the boat is surfaced. And there will also be one further back on the rudder as well, because the submarine will present such a low profile on the surface that it would be easy for a ship to just run it over in the middle of the night. Now, the 581 there means that Blueback is the 581st planned submarine commissioned by the U.S. Navy. That number is actually never going to be repeated, and the current subs that we're building now are taking that number into the 800s. Now, that small wing that sticks out of the side of the sail is known as a sail plane or fairwater plane. There's one on either side of the sail. Those are to provide some modest and fine depth control when the submarine is underwater. There are 2 more planes on the back where the rudder is, which are actually underwater, you can't see them, known as stern planes on either side of the rudder. And those control the angle or pitch of the boat and more gross depth control. Now, this funny gap that you see along the hull of the submarine is what's known as the turtleback or the superstructure. It's a metal fairing that covers the top of the submarine, and the purpose is to provide a flat deck for the crew to walk on when the boat is surfaced. And underneath the turtleback are just pipes, valves, and storage spaces for the deck equipment up there. And yes, it is an original part of the submarine. So technically, the superstructure is that fairing and the sail itself. So former Blueback sailors told me that they usually called that the superstructure and not actually the turtleback, but one of them does concede that yes, turtleback kind of makes more sense. Now, in terms of her size, Blueback is 219 feet and 6 inches long, about a fourth of the length of Titanic, and she is 29 feet wide at the beam. If you measured from the bottom of the submarine, the keel, all the way to the top of the sail, it's about 48 feet high. Now, OMSI got the submarine in 1994 through a community effort led by Senator Mark Hatfield, himself a U.S. Navy veteran, and she was towed down here and placed here as a permanent exhibit and a submarine memorial. She's attached these big triangular steel A-frame pilings here on either side with those pylons there. And she has not moved from this spot since, with the exception of when she was last tugged into dry dock in 1998 for maintenance. Now, OMSI put these doors in here as a convenience for you and me. This is not the original entrance to the submarine. The original entrance is actually up on deck behind the doors. You'll be crawling through a 25-inch diameter topside deck hatch and down a vertical ladder. But of course, the museum's insurance company said that that was dangerous or something, so we don't make you do it. Anyway, so let's head on inside and we're gonna start touring the rest of the submarine. All right, folks, now as we descend these stairs, or this ladder here, you notice that here on the left, we are passing through what used to be one of the fuel ballast tanks for the submarine. This one, in particular, holding over 12,500 gallons of fuel. You also see the lines denoting where the outer hull and the inner pressure hull were as well, and I'll describe a little bit more about those in a little bit. Now, as we reach the bottom of the stairs here, we enter what is the fanciest, nicest part of the entire submarine. This is what we call officer country. So from that door, that bulkhead back, along this blue carpeted area to that wall back there, were for the 8 officers. There would be 77 enlisted sailors in addition who lived one deck below, so the Blueback would normally have a total crew of around 85 men. Now, this entrance and exit ladder is not original to the submarine. They go through what used to be a 3-man junior officer stateroom, going from this bulkhead to that bulkhead and back here to essentially the curvature of the pressure hull. So there would have been 3 officers in here normally. Because the original entrance is actually right up here. That hatch up there leads to the topside deck, so all the crew and all the food and everything gets loaded down that hatch. It's coming down this 19-foot straight vertical ladder. If you're an officer, you'd stop up here. And if you're an enlisted sailor, this panel here lifts up. You crawl further down that ladder into the crew's mess one deck below. So that's the original entrance. Now, the museum's insurance company tends to frown upon vertical ladders. They don't like these things, so we're not going to make you go down them. So we put that in for ease of access. Going further back here, on the port side, we have another, what used to be a 3-man officer's stateroom, but it's now been converted to one of our offices. And on the other side here, we have the officer's head. There are 2 wash basins in here, a head or toilet, and a shower for the 8 officers to share. Going further back forward, along the starboard side, we encounter what used to be the executive officer's stateroom. Normally, he'd have this room all to himself, but if there is a dignitary or a higher ranking officer or a high ranking guest coming on board, then the executive officer has another bunk in here that would fold down from right here, the overhead, and it's basically just a flat place for that person to sleep. So, but again, you can see here that the table folds back into the wall. These benches here would fold down and they create the sleeping berth for the executive officer. So this is now currently our break room. Moving further forward here, we enter more into officer's country. We have the officer's pantry right over here, and the luxury suite of the entire submarine, the commanding officer's or captain's stateroom. He's the only one on board who gets his own private room. It is about the size of a small walk-in closet. This is literally all it is, but it is the nicest one. It is, in fact, the biggest stateroom, and it's about a foot wider on either side than the executive officer's stateroom. So you can see he's got a sink in here. He's got a closet for his uniforms, his own writing desk, and the largest bed. Indeed, this bed is larger than the rest, and it is also the only one you can actually sit up in without banging your head into anything. So, perks of being a submarine captain. A couple of things in here I'll point out is that, of course, we have a poster showing the Blueback's World War II battle flag. Not the Blueback as in SS-581, but Blueback as in SS-326. Because this is back in the day when they still named submarines after fish, and this Blueback is not the first Blueback, but rather the second Blueback to be named for a submarine. So the original Blueback SS-326 was a World War II fleet boat. She served in World War II, and that is her battle flag. So we put this there kind of as a reminder of the heritage of Blueback herself. We have an assortment of uniforms here. We have a lieutenant commander's dress whites there, and yes, I know that that combination cover, has scrambled eggs on it and is not appropriate for that particular rank, but the other one we have is actually dirty, so we display the clean one there. And we have a donated uniform from Commander Stuart Taylor. Now, that uniform is not from one of the captains. There was never a captain of this submarine named Commander Taylor. But that is actually Stuart Taylor's uniform. He was one of the, I believe, the former engineering officers on board Blueback, and he was one of the very instrumental people in bringing the submarine here and basically telling us a lot about it. So he donated his uniform. He has since passed, but it is there as in remembrance of him. Furthermore, people sometimes occasionally ask what the rose is for. That is because Portland is also known as the Rose City. So there's that. We have a pretty cool box. That box that back there actually belonged to the Blueback, and we believe that is one of the original sextants that she had. So that is the captain's lovely stateroom. The lap of luxury right here. It took him like, 15, 20 years to get a stateroom like this all to himself. Now, even if there's a high-ranking dignitary, an admiral, an officer, or someone coming on board, they do not bump the captain from his stateroom. The commanding officer of a vessel does not give up his command or his stateroom for anybody else coming on board. So that person would instead, of course, take the bunk back in the executive officer's stateroom. The captain keeps his room. Now we've entered here into this large space. This is the officer's wardroom. So this table is the largest one on board. The officers would sit around here. Normally the captain, I've been told, sits right about there, and the other officers are around the periphery of the table. There used to be actually a bench right here for additional officers. So the 8 officers would sit here. They do their paperwork, have their free time, and of course eat their meals. Officers that are enlisted on submarines eat the exact same food. The difference is in the presentation though. Now all the food, however, is made down below us in the galley. The officer's food is brought up here to the officer's pantry like I showed you via this dumbwaiter right behind these 2 small doors here. In this pantry there would be an enlisted sailor called the steward. He would plate up the food on this nice china here and serve it through that pass-through through the officers. Now, unlike what a lot of people think, the pantry itself is not the galley. It's not a kitchen. No food is really made in here with the exception of like coffee and toast and some snacks or whatever for the officers. But the steward's whole purpose is to basically take care of the officers, right? He'll make you a sandwich if you're hungry or whatever, provide you with a snack or something. He takes the dishes, he washes them, he puts them away in the cabinets up here. And he'll take the pots and pans from the meal, put them back in the dumbwaiter, and send them back down to the scullery to be cleaned. So, but again, it's not a kitchen. No food is actually made in here, per se. So that's the officer's pantry. Now, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time here in the wardroom. I'm going to talk about the various artifacts you see in here. So first of all, starting with the fact that above this table is a really nice looking chandelier. Yes. Now this is not your normal dining room table light. People might recognize this is actually an operating room lamp because the wardroom on a ship is a battle dressing station in the event of casualties. We're going to turn on this lamp, lay you down here, ask you where it hurts. The problem is that submarines are not large enough to warrant having a physician, a doctor on board. Instead, they have what is called the independent duty corpsman. Now, it's not your standard Navy hospital corpsman. The independent duty corpsmen on a submarine, at least in this day and age, they go through an initial 14 to 15 weeks of medical training with the US Navy, and to be on a submarine, they have to go through an additional 52 weeks, that is a full year of more advanced training, including submarine school, to handle things like disease pathologies, more advanced medical techniques, things like that. And they can do everything from pass out aspirin, patch up bumps, cuts, and bruises, or even take your appendix out if they had to. They could do a minor surgery if they needed to on this table. So basically they are the equivalent of roughly a physician's assistant / EMT to supervise the medical needs of a submarine crew. Now, one story I've been told, but I have not been able to verify, it may just be hearsay for all I know, is that there has been an appendix removed on this table on Blueback. So the way the story is told to me is that the guy was lying here, the corpsman was here doing the operation. There's a guy over here with a direct line to the captain in the control room. And there's a guy standing next to the corpsman with a medical textbook walking him through the procedure. But apparently the guy lived, and when they were about 600 feet underwater, the corpsman had finished up the stitches, phone talker told the captain, and they got the submarine to the surface and then got that crew member off the submarine. So they had to do it that way because his appendix was in danger of bursting and he could have died. One operation I'm almost fairly certain did occur on this table was in February of 1970. According to the deck logs of the Blueback, one of the sailors was working up in the sail, and for some reason his foot got caught in a hydraulic ram for one of the sail planes, which for whatever reason was moving at the time, and the ram, quote unquote, traumatically amputated the toes on his right foot. So, now it doesn't say anything beyond that, but I assume that he would have been brought in here. Maybe the corpsman either bandaged him up, or I've been told that he may have partially amputated what was left of his right toes and bandaged it up, and then they evacuated that crewman via a Coast Guard helicopter to a nearby hospital. That is one operation we do know most likely was performed on this table. So there's that. Now, to go over the basics first of how exactly a submarine works, modern submarines are single-hulled, but they still do have ballast tanks, but the Barbel-class and a number of other submarines that came after, they are actually double-hulled. So everything we saw outside, the black part, is the outer hull of the submarine. We are now inside the inner hull or pressure hull, as you saw there, those orange and red lines. Between the two hulls are about 3 feet of empty spaces, called the ballast tanks. A series of flood ports that are open to the ocean are on the bottom, and a series of vents are on the top. We open these vents, the air goes out, and about 490 tons of seawater fills the ballast tanks, making the submarine heavier than the water it displaces. It becomes negatively buoyant, and then it dives or submerges underwater. It does not sink. Sink is what Titanic did. We want to avoid that. It's a bad thing on a submarine. Now to get back to the surface, there are a couple ways to actually surface a submarine. If it's underwater and it's just neutrally buoyant, then I've been told you can kind of angle the planes and sort of drive the submarine up to the surface. And when you get to the surface, you can blow ballast, get that water out of the ballast tanks, and you'll just float onto the surface. There is a low pressure blow system using, I believe, 400 pounds of air. You can blow that air into the ballast tanks. That'll force the water back out to the bottom, and you rise to the surface. There is also a high pressure blow system of 3000 psi air, and you can blow that to quickly remove that water. Furthermore, if you need to get the submarine to the surface like right now, or otherwise you never get back, you can throw 2 switches in the control room called the chicken switches. That's the emergency blow system. Now that immediately blows 3000 psi air into these ballast tanks, immediately evacuates that water, and you basically do an uncontrolled ascent. And it looks a little something like this. Now this is not the Blueback, this is actually the USS Houston performing what's known as an emergency blow for the movie The Hunt for October. She was playing the USS Dallas in that movie. Now this is very cinematic, it's coming up at a fairly steep angle for the movie, but you know, just imagine it's kind of something like that. So Blueback could do this same maneuver, and that would take her, I've been told, from about 700 feet underwater to the surface in about 58 seconds. Now generally your ears will not pop when you do this because the pressure hull will be completely sealed on a submarine, so you shouldn't feel any particular change in pressure. But I've been told by sailors who have done it on submarines that it either is A, the most boring experience of your life, or B, the most terrifying experience of your life. A ballistic missile submarine like a large boomer maybe would only practice this every once in a blue moon. And those sailors who have been on ballistic missile submarines who have done that, they say like, yeah, it's actually kind of scary. Now, indeed, if there is an emergency, like a fire or flooding on the submarine, and you need to get to the surface now and you're doing an emergency blow, then yes, it is quite frightening. But attack submarines, I've been told, regularly practice this, at least a couple times a year at that. And it's been described to me by those sailors as the lamest roller coaster ever. It's like a very fast elevator ride. It only goes one way, just up. The submarine just tilts up, and you lean forward and you hold on to something, and that's it. You're like, oh, that was an emergency blow? Yep, that's it. Now the hull of the submarine is made out of this material. This is a piece of our inner pressure hull. It's a 1.5 inch thick piece of HY80 steel, and the outer hull is roughly half of this thickness. That's what keeps the ocean from squishing the boat. So HY80 is a high yield, low carbon steel composed of nickel, chromium, and molybdenum, among other trace elements. The 80 means it can withstand 80,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. This allows the submarine to dive down to an operational test depth of about 712 feet. Now, it can indeed go deeper. There's about a 50% safety margin in there. But if we hit 1,050 feet, or about 320 meters, then we've just voided the warranty on that, and the submarine will likely implode. That fast. Actually faster than that. You wouldn't even register it. So if it's any consolation, dying on a submarine that just imploded means you wouldn't feel anything. Now, the crush depth on a submarine is not absolute. It doesn't mean like once we immediately hit, 1,049, 1,050 feet, bam, it just gives up. It's a mathematical calculation, but you do not want to find out where that crush depth is because you don't come back from it. Now, there are varying grades of HY steels beyond HY80. There's like HY100, HY130 to give a couple of examples. The Seawolves, and I'm pretty sure the Virginia-class submarines, are made out of HY100 steels. Two of the LA-class submarines actually had HY100 inserts to test them, and the thing is though, the higher up you go, the stronger the steel is, but the more difficult it is to weld. So when they were constructing the Seawolf submarines in the 90s, they found cracks in the welds, which necessitated going back and redoing them, because they have to be basically perfect. So that delayed the construction of the Seawolves. The Seawolves are essentially the ultimate Cold War attack submarine. So they're meant to dive very deep, be very quiet, and they have like all the torpedoes and missiles on them. The Virginia-class submarines, according to I think Tom Clancy and Norman Polmar, from what I've read in their books, they're made out of HY100 steel as well, the pressure hulls anyway. But the thing is, they're not as thick as a Seawolf because the Virginia-class submarines are not meant to dive as deep, and they're meant to operate more in the littoral, kind of coastal areas. That's the area that Virginia-class submarines are better off in, as opposed to deep in the ocean like Seawolves. Now, the US Navy used HY80 steel to build most of its combat submarines, I believe, during the Cold War. It is an extremely good material to make submarine pressure hulls out of, valued for its strength-to-weight ratio. So here's the thing. Some people ask, like, oh, what about that submarine, the Titan, that was going to go down to see Titanic and it imploded? Yeah, let me put it this way. Stockton Rush did not know how to make submarines, and he paid for it with his life. As they say, safety regulations are written in blood, and he just added to that long list. Carbon fiber is not a contiguous material. From my understanding, in the history of us using HY steels of varying types to make submarines, it has never failed and resulted in the loss of a submarine. Now, that's not to say we've never lost submarines made out of HY steels. For example, the USS Thresher and USS Scorpion in 1963 and 1968, respectively, they sank with a loss of all hands. But we're pretty sure it was not the steel that failed. What does fail, though, first, is some kind of through-hull penetration, like a valve or a pipe or something like that. That's what's going to go before that steel gives. Now, you may also be wondering, like, oh, wait a minute, like you said the Blueback could go down to 1,050 feet. There's not 80,000 pounds of pressure, down at that depth. And yes, that's true. But like I said, something else besides the steel will fail first. So from my understanding, when Blueback was built anyway, the pressure hull of a submarine was good for roughly 30 years, give or take, because it can only withstand so many cycles of diving down to test depth and coming back up to the surface before the metal begins to fatigue out. And that's just true for just about anything. Now, they are keeping some of the Los Angeles-class submarines and the Ohio-class submarines in service for like 40 plus years, but at some risk to their capabilities. So whether or not that makes the sailors who serve on them feel very comfortable is debatable. So, every time you dive down to test depth, right, the pressure hull is gonna compress a bit, and when you rise back up to the surface, again, it loses pressure, so that pressure hull kind of, decompresses. Now, I've been told by former sailors on Blueback that, for example, if the submarine dove down to test depth, they could tie a string from one side to the other on the pressure hull, and when they go down to test depth, they will see the string noticeably start to sag in the middle. And when they get down to test depth, they can tie that string off so it's taut, and when they go back up to the surface, that string will snap. Again, the hull is decompressing when it goes back up. I recently talked to a Los Angeles-class submarine sailor, and he told me similarly, like on his boat, they would do the same thing, but you wouldn't see as much of a noticeable sag in the string. It would just kind of noticeably get looser. But anyway, so HY steels are very good for making submarines out of. You may have also heard some submarines may be made out of titanium hulls, and yes, that is true. In the United States, for example, the Alvin DSV, she originally had an HY steel pressure hull, but that's since been replaced several times actually by a titanium pressure sphere for the crew. Now, titanium is very corrosion resistant, it's extremely lightweight and very strong for its weight. So it's very good material to make submarines out of. Now, mind you, I am not a metallurgist or a physicist, but let me give you a basic understanding of why titanium is very good, but not necessarily a great material in terms of operating a submarine, because titanium is a very specific material. It requires a lot of specialized equipment and specialized skills, and manpower to work on. Furthermore, every time a titanium-hulled submarine dives down to test depth and comes back up, that test depth gets a little bit more shallow every time. And owing to its nature, because it requires specialized equipment and skills to work on, a titanium-hulled submarine has only so many ports that it can pull into if something goes wrong with the hull. So it's like, oh, we can't just go to any old port, that can maybe work with a steel like HY80 or something. No, we have to go back to a very specific port to service the submarine if something's wrong with our titanium-hulled sub. There's pros and cons to each of them. Titanium has its pros and cons, same with steels as well. The Soviets experimented with using titanium hulls on some of their attack submarines like the Alphas and the Sierras, I believe. And some of these submarines could dive very, very deep. But anyway, the US Navy always pretty much used HY steels to make their combat submarines in the Cold War. Now on that back wall over there, we have what are known as dolphin pins. So those are 48 countries around the world that have or had submarines, and each has their own version of that. It's a submarine warfare pin, and that's awarded to sailors who have qualified on submarines. The United States is over there on the far left. The gold are for officers, and the silver are for enlisted. We also have kind of that skinny one in the middle there. That's a World War II War Patrol pin. You would have gotten those if you served on subs in World War II and did a war patrol. And on the bottom there is a ballistic missile patrol pin. You get those if you did a deterrent patrol on a ballistic missile submarine. Now, to earn your dolphins, at least in the United States Navy, and for a number of others as well, you have to volunteer for submarines. Nobody is ever just assigned to a submarine. So after boot camp, then you raise your hand and say, I want to be on submarines. And if you are selected for an enlisted sailor, you would go through 2 months of basic enlisted submarine school, or BESS, and that basically teaches you enough to make you dangerous. And assumingly you've done your A school and all that, so you're qualified in your rating and all that, your job. When you get to a submarine, then you spend roughly, for Blueback, 9 to 12 months, and you have to learn every single system on the submarine. You have to be familiar with the buttons and knobs and switches and pipes and valves and wires and stuff like that, how to operate systems. You have a working knowledge of all the systems and just about everybody else's job. You need to know what to do in various emergencies. You're going to get signed off on this qual sheet, and on modern submarines, that sheet can have upwards of 100 signatures or more. And once you're signed off on all this, you go before a panel of officers and enlisted, you'll answer questions to their satisfaction, you'll draw out diagrams of pipes or wires for them, and when they feel like you know what you're talking about, then you're awarded your dolphin pins. We have a large example up here. Now, before you earn your dolphins, you're what is known as a NUB, N-U-B. That means non-useful body or new underway buddy or a non-qual or whatever, but most of them just still say NUB. And that means you are a danger to the submarine. You are not going to be doing anything in your free time for that first year or so except studying and studying and studying some more until you get qualified. And when you earn your dolphins, only then are you officially allowed to call yourself a submariner and a member of the crew. That means you can be trusted. You're not going to panic if something goes wrong on the submarine. There's a lot of hard work and studying involved to get qualified on a submarine and get your dolphins. But they'll talk about that for the rest of their life. Now, the process for officers is very similar, but once the officer, or the officer-to-be, graduates from the Naval Academy, or they've gone through a 4-year university, and they've gotten their commission, then again, they volunteer to be on submarines. If they're selected, then they go through a series of interviews, and they go through, in today's nuclear-powered submarine fleet, they go through 6 months at the nuclear power school in the Navy, and that teaches them the theoretical physics and stuff behind nuclear energy. Following that, they go through 6 months on a nuclear-powered training unit, or a prototype, because these are the prototype nuclear reactors before they mass-produce them and put them on submarines. So that's on land, and they're going to apply that knowledge from nuclear power school on working on that nuclear reactor. Then they go through 3 months at the submarine officer's basic course, and that's basically the officer version of submarine school. Then they get to a submarine, and then, much like the enlisted sailors, they have to qualify on everything on the submarine, earn their dolphins, the gold ones in this case, and then they are now a submarine officer. Now, to become a submarine captain, it's going to require you to climb up the ranks of an officer throughout a 15, maybe 20-year career in the Navy on submarines. You're going to do everything like qualifying as an engineering officer, qualifying as a department head. You're going to go through more advanced schooling. You'll probably do a tour at Joint Staff College or maybe the Naval War College or wherever, something like that. You're going to get higher education. You're going to go through the Prospective Executive Officers course. You're going to serve as the XO on a submarine for a while. You're going to get further recommendations, go through additional training like the Submarine Advanced Officers course. You're going to go through the Prospective Commanding Officers course and get checked off on all that, and just maybe at the end of all this, then the Navy will choose you to be the commanding officer or the captain of your very own submarine. So that's a very basic process of how to become a submarine captain. So it's much more involved. And you'll know everything from how to use the weapons, how tactics and strategy, and how to fight the submarine and all that. So it's much more in-depth for officers. Now, talking about some of the models in this room, up here is a display from Ingalls Shipbuilding, the builder, of how Blueback looked like when she originally entered service. One particular thing that was different is that she originally had her planes on the bow of the submarine. In examining her deck logs, we believe sometime probably after July of 1962, I think it was, she was in dry dock in Mare Island, I think it was, and her planes got moved up to the sail where they became sailplanes. So just a couple of years after she entered service in '59, those bow planes became sailplanes. I've been told there are a number of reasons for why that change was made. For one thing, the sonar arrays are at the front of the submarine in the bow, above and below the torpedo tubes. And the hydraulic movement of the planes and the water moving over the planes tended to create a lot of noise for the sonar systems, making it difficult for the sonar technicians to hear anything. Additionally, with the planes up on the sail becoming sailplanes, they provide a little bit better depth control, especially when the submarine is shallow at like periscope depth, for allowing the submarine to more easily maintain control of its depth when it's in shallow waters or at periscope depth, or it needs to raise up an antenna or something. So when they're on the bow, when you just have like stern and bow planes, that's better for angular control of the submarine. But when the planes are on the sail up there, it's a bit better for depth control. So I've been told. I may very well be wrong. Case in point is that sometime around like 1962, about mid-1962, those bow planes became sailplanes. Now, for a better idea of how Blueback looked like compared to other submarines, we have a model display here. We have 7-scale model submarines, and that one is the Blueback. Again, as I mentioned, part of the Barbel-class, right, having this teardrop-shaped hull. Below the Blueback is an older World War II fleet boat that's specifically a Gato-class submarine. That's essentially what she replaced, and those are basically, based on the shape, more or less a surface ship that only dives underwater when it was attacking or being attacked. But Blueback can go about almost 3 times faster underwater than those could. Now, the original model display of this actually had these wooden models, and the fleet boat looked more like a Guppy converted fleet boat. The guy who made this model display for us and 3D printed up these models, I asked him, well, can you actually make this a like World War II era looking fleet boat? And that's what he did. So props to him. Below that, we have the Los Angeles class fast attack nuclear powered submarines. And this specific one is actually USS Memphis, the boat that the model maker served on. So yeah, that's the Memphis, the workhorse of the US submarine fleet. And those are now gradually being replaced by the Virginia class attack submarines. This one underneath it is the up and coming USS Oklahoma, the first Virginia Block 5 submarine. So, and that submarine, at the time I'm filming this, doesn't even exist yet. It's going to enter service, we think, sometime around mid-2027 or thereabouts. Another funny story is that the model maker, when he made this display, he's in here giving a tour and he's telling them about these various models. And one teenager, or some kid or whatever, apparently knew everything about submarines. He's like, well, actually, it's not a Virginia, that's a Seawolf, or like the Jimmy Carter or something, yeah. And he's like, no, that's a Virginia Block 5 submarine. No, it isn't. Well, I made up these models, I 3D printed them, and I modeled that one on a Virginia Block 5 submarine, so that's what it is. It's not a Seawolf. At the very top here, we have the largest submarines in the US Navy. That's an Ohio-class submarine, a ballistic missile submarine. We made 18 of those. The first 4 of them were actually converted to guided missile submarines. They're 560 feet long, a little bit shy of 2 football fields. They're all still in service. They're currently scheduled to eventually be replaced by the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines. And those, I think, are just about the same dimensions, but I think they're about like 1 foot wider in the beam or something like that. Here at the bottom, we have the largest submarines in the entire world. That is the famous Russian Akula or Typhoon class submarines. 6 of these were made, and these basically were a little bit longer than an Ohio, but twice as wide, and they displaced roughly as much as the Titanic. That being said, they're a bit too expensive for Russia to operate, so they're all out of service. Now, I've been told, or I've read, that at least one of these is scheduled to be converted to a museum ship in St. Petersburg, Russia. So maybe someday we can go tour that. That would be pretty cool. And over here on the left, we have some little bitty ones. This top one up here is the USS Holland, the Navy's very first commissioned, not first submarine, mind you, but first commissioned submarine, which entered service in 1900. It was 53 feet long and had a whopping big crew of 6 men. And for a better understanding of just the size of these things, just beneath the Holland is a 40-foot bus. Clearly, we've come a long way with submarines since the Holland, literally. And furthermore, if you take either of these submarines, the Ohio or the Typhoon, put them in downtown Portland and stick them up on their end, they would literally be the tallest building in the city. So that's how big we're talking with some of these submarines. Pretty cool, huh? Now this map here shows Blueback's operating area. She spent her entire career in the Pacific Fleet. She was built here by Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi. They still make warships, but Ingalls does not build submarines anymore. She came down here through the Panama Canal. Her initial home port was in San Diego, and then she was moved to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And she did her last couple of years in her service in San Diego again. But these red dots show every port that she officially visited throughout her years of service. She's been all the way to Hong Kong and Beppu and Sasebo and all that, and Perth, Australia, and all the way down to Talcahuano, Chile as well. She's even been to places in Korea as well. So, but those aren't marked on the map. And other places along that we can't talk about. She did do a number of patrols as well off the coast of Vietnam during that particular conflict. And of course, she spent a good amount of time spying on the Russians up there around Vladivostok and all that. Now over here, we have a number of different safes. We have 4 safes here essentially. Different combinations, right? And the more locks it has on it, like that one down there, means the more secure it is and the more important things would be in there. And of course, we could even padlock this one and make it even more secure. But in other words, no one person has the combinations for both those locks to get into that safe. Now this one we could actually get open when the Navy gave us a submarine. There's a very important piece of equipment in here. I'm gonna open it up, okay? But yeah, kids, you might wanna cover your eyes. Now this is a very important piece of equipment for when we want to watch submarine movies. An ancient CRT TV. Yeah. Obviously, no, that would not have been in there. So, but normally what would have been in the safes are things like probably payroll, because you want to dole out some of the money for the sailors when you pull into a port so they can spend it. They might have narcotics in there for the corpsmen. They would have operational orders, technical manuals, things like that in there. We have no idea what is in these particular 2 safes here, because simply put, we cannot get them open. I've had people suggest different combinations to try for this, and I've tried them. They don't work. So yes, these are locked. For all we know, they're most likely just empty, and the Navy emptied them before they handed the submarine over. So there's probably just nothing in them, but there could be like gold bars or diamonds and rubies and jewels in there for all we know, or something like that. What's even more funny is we speculate, we'll probably get this open someday, and there'll be a little slip of paper telling you the combination of the actual safe. And before anyone asks, no, we are not going to drill the lock here and damage the safe just to get it open. No, we want to preserve this stuff for posterity. We don't really care much about what is in them, but we like to say there's something really secret in there. A couple other things I want to talk about in this room is that Blueback had some time on the big and the small screen. Now again, I'll go back to this photo here. One common misconception is that Blueback was in the movie The Hunt for October, but this is not the Blueback. As I mentioned, it's the USS Houston performing that maneuver. Blueback's screen time in the movie The Hunt for October was real big. It was right up here. This was taken in our torpedo room, and these are 3 sailors. They paid them about $50 each. They shaved their heads, dressed them in these Soviet uniforms, and they stared at the camera. So it's about 28 minutes into the film when Captain Ramius, Sean Connery, who's the most Scottish-sounding submarine skipper in the whole Soviet Navy, he basically says, 28 minutes in the film, he's giving a spiel to his crew, and he's like, "Comrades, we're going to Havana, Cuba." And this shot pops up. It's like 4.5 seconds long. If you blink, you miss it. So that is Blueback's role in The Hunt for October. And I made a video on that earlier as well. So check that out. So obviously we are a big deal in that movie. Blueback, however, did spend more time on the small screen. Now this might look familiar with some of the older people. This is Hawaii Five-0, the original series, not the new one. Jack Lord, Steve McGarrett, right? Blueback was home port in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii at the time, and the TV production said, "Oh, we want a nuclear-powered submarine," and the Navy's like,
"You serious?"
No. But you can have Blueback. She looks very, very similar. So he drives up the pier, he goes aboard, he drinks some coffee. We have those exact cups actually. He talks to a chief petty officer, gets some information on case he's working, and then leaves. And that was Blueback's time on the small screen. And one more thing that I'm going to point out in here is people sometimes ask what this is. It's a sound-powered phone. These are still used on ships and submarines today. It's technology that's nearly 100 years old now. You ever done the two cans with a string attached between them? It's basically a couple steps above that. So what you do is you select what station you want to call on this black dial. You turn the crank a few times, and what that does is that it rings the howler from the speaker on the other end of the line, and that's the signal for the person to pick up the phone and talk into it. So now, some people think that this is like a field telephone, so you have to constantly crank this thing to generate power for the phone, but it doesn't work like that. All this does, when you crank this, is that it rings the buzzer at the other end for the person to pick up. Now, basically the way a sound-powered phone works is that we have a cutaway here. In this phone, there is let me put it down here. In this phone, when you speak into it, it's going to vibrate a diaphragm. Attached to this diaphragm is an armature. There's a magnet and a coil of wire in there, and when the armature vibrates, it generates electricity, and that powers the entire phone system. So you pick it up, you press the button, and you start speaking. Even if a ship or a submarine loses power throughout, it can still communicate on the sound-powered phones. So, yep. Also known as growlers. So, if you're a new guy on the ship or the submarine, you're probably going to be sent looking for batteries for the sound-powered phone. I'm still looking for them myself. They're somewhere. All right. So I think that about does it for the wardroom. So next stop, we're going to continue forward through this door here, and we're going to go into the control room. All right, let's move forward through this door into the control room. And right over here, we have the yeoman shack, the ship's office essentially. Paperwork is important for any large organization, the Navy included, and as they say in large organizations, one of the people who you want to make friends with is the secretary, because that's what the yeoman is. He's going to make sure you get paid, he's going to make sure you officially exist on paper, and if you're really nice to him, he might be able to expedite your request for leave, that you want for your, kid's birthday or Christmas or something. So this is our yeoman shack. That's literally all it is. It's just a big long desk, some typewriters and stuff like that. So if you want to learn how to type hunched over and deal with all the paperwork, then the yeoman rating just might be for you. Over here we have the submarine's radio room, and as the signs would suggest, this is a highly restricted area. In fact, it'd be one of the most secure and restricted areas on the boat. If you were not a radio man, you would not be allowed anywhere near this space. And if you're, say, just an electrician and you need to work on the wiring in here, then you would need an escort in here to mind you as you work on whatever you're doing. Now, all the top secret equipment has been taken off this submarine, so no doubt the radio room looked very different back in the day. Now, it's currently an active amateur ham radio station under the call sign W7SUB up there, you see. So we do have radio operators that come in every so often. They'll transmit from the station. They'll talk to other museum ships out there, so that's pretty cool. Now, back there through that door is what's known as the crypto room. That's for the cryptologic technicians, also known as spooks, to operate in. According to a former Blueback officer we talked to, there might be about 6 to 8 spooks on board. They'd be responsible for using the equipment back there to intercept, decode, interpret, and translate signals that the submarine picks up, if they're operating, say, off the coast of the Soviet Union somewhere. So, indeed, that's what they do. Now moving forward here, we have this passageway known as IC Alley for internal communications. There are various switchboards in this space here, and I'm going to kind of go down this space and talk about each of them. So, starting right over here, that is the Dead Reckoning Analyzer. This examines the boat's course, distance traveled, and position in longitude and latitude. And down here, right there, is one of the backup gyroscopic compasses. That's the Mark 23, I believe. Further forward on this side, this kind of padded thing right here, and this thing right up here that looks kind of like a periscope handle, which it's not. These are the manual controls for the snorkel exhaust and the snorkel air induction. So if for some reason we can't get the exhaust or the air induction here open, we can manually turn these valves and open them up by hand. Now, occasionally we do have visitors ask, like, what are these hanging cans up here? Why are the cans hanging around the submarine? From my understanding, when Blueback was brought to the museum in 1994, they had a bunch of the old crew members come through the submarine on a tour, and they sort of critiqued it and said, like, oh, this is right and that's wrong, maybe change that, you know, or I don't remember any of that. But reportedly, some of the old former crew members, and I guess one of the former captains, he said, where are the hanging cans? Because these cans are collecting hydraulic fluid. There's a number of hydraulic systems on the submarine, and they were actually leaking like a sieve by the end of Blueback's service. So that's what they do. Said, like, there needs to be more hanging cans collecting hydraulic fluid. So he puts them up to kind of make it more realistic. But that being said, some of them are indeed collecting hydraulic fluid, people, so don't futz with them if you come on board. So don't play with them. So they are serving an actual purpose. So these are hydraulic lines up here. So that's what the cans are for. So moving back over here, this thing right here is a switchboard for internal communications on the submarine. This one is for the 1MC and 7MC stack, the internal communication circuits. So this one here is a switchboard for lots of lights and indicators, alarms, etc. on the submarine. And further forward here, this one with all these kind of horizontal metal rods, this is the cutout switchboard for energizing and de-energizing equipment, mostly related to navigation, dead reckoning, underwater log, etc. This console right here with the nice little lights on it is the control cabinet for the Mark 19 main gyroscopic compass, which is actually right over here, that barrel-shaped object right there. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. And further forward right here, next to the control cabinet, is the switchboard for the fire control systems. Now, the main gyroscopic compass here for navigation has a number of gyroscopes in it, and what they do is they spin at high speed, and they'll maintain their orientation so that the submarine basically is moving around the gyroscopes, and that essentially lets us know what direction we're pointed in. So this feeds into the dead reckoning system to tell us our position, and I'll talk a little bit more about basic submarine navigation a bit later when we get into the control room proper. Now, this funny kind of curved pipe here coming out of this cabinet here and going into this object right here, that is a winch, because inside that cabinet would be about 1,000-foot long very low frequency or VLF radio antenna that they can stream out behind the sail of the submarine. Using that, we can receive very low frequency radio signals down to about test depth for the submarine. Now mind you, there's not a high data rate on this, but it does allow for receiving communications when the submarine is at depth. And moving further here, we actually pass by the attack center. I'm going to talk about this a bit later. And moving forward here, we now enter the control room proper. So the control room is essentially the nerve center for the submarine. This room would normally have about 6 to 8 people in it, but if we sound the general alarm and go to battle stations, then there could be up to 14 to 17 people in this room itself. We are actually directly beneath the sail, which is above us. Now, the Tang-class submarines were the first submarines in the U.S. Navy to move all the fire control equipment down into the control room itself and create the attack center. So, unlike a World War II fleet boat, there's no separate pressure hull above us, so it's not a conning tower up there, it's just the sail. It houses the masts, which you see the 2 periscopes right here. Furthermore, the Barbel-class submarines were arguably the first boats to introduce a more modern layout of a U.S. submarine control room. So this will look pretty familiar to a lot of submarine sailors today, especially ones who have served on like later submarines after the Barbel-class and even up to like the LA-class submarines. So we have the periscope stand here in the center. Up there we have the ship control station, or the diving station as it's sometimes called, or the pilot station today. The ballast control panel is also right there on the port side. Further back here we have the navigation station and the fire control systems over there on the starboard side. Now the one kind of strange thing here is that there's no real sonar stations or, the sonar room is not up here, which is kind of odd for a modern day submarine sailor, but they're actually below us down that ladder there, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But interestingly enough, on the USS Barbel, the sonar shack was actually further back in Icy Alley. It was actually right behind, accessible right through a door, which would have been back here, kind of where the crypto room is, essentially behind the gyroscopic compass. So that's one thing Tony told us when he said, oh, the layout of the Barbel was different from Blueback. Now, people often ask, what is with all the red lighting in here? Well, unlike in the movies, it has nothing to do with red alert, battle stations, and all that stuff. Nope. It's known as rigged for red. The rods in your eyes are less sensitive to red light because it's a lower wavelength, less energy. So the thing is, red light tells the crew that it's nighttime out, and it also allows your eyes to adjust to darkness if you're looking through these periscopes at nighttime. Now let me switch it to white here to give you an idea here. I'll keep it on white here so we can see everything. But white light, for one thing, completely ruins your night vision. Have you ever gone from a bright white lit room into a dark room? It's black, you can't see anything for a while because it takes about 30 to 45 minutes for your eyes to fully adjust and dilate to the darkness. So the white light also creates a problem because these periscopes are optical, and the white light would actually travel up these periscopes through the eyepieces, and you could see the white light coming out of the periscope as like a little pinpoint of light from miles at sea, and you have just given away the position of the submarine. Obviously, you don't want to do that, so the lights are kept red here at nighttime and at periscope depth to keep the submarine stealthy. So let me go over some of the things in this room. In the center, we have the periscope stand. This is normally where the officer of the deck, or the OOD, would be. He would be controlling the movement and operations of the submarine. It could be the captain, it could be another officer. We have two periscopes here. This forward one right here is what is normally the observation periscope. It is a Type 8 periscope. The rear one is the attack scope, a Type 2 periscope. The attack scope is actually smaller in profile in the head to make it harder to visually see when it's on the surface. And these periscopes would also have different antennas for things like electronic countermeasures, ECM, radar, etc. However, neither of these periscopes are original to the submarine because the Navy removed them prior to turning the submarine over to the museum. They probably had classified equipment on them, so I've been told. So what they are, they're actually both attack periscopes. So that's why they look pretty much identical. And I'll throw some pictures up showing you that image of what it looks like through each of these. So when the veterans group that was prepping the submarine for conversion into a museum ship, they had to scrounge up two periscopes from somewhere. And these are the periscopes that they found. So like I said, neither of these was original to the submarine. Furthermore, these gray cones below them are not original either. They have these steps on them, and they're holding the periscopes up so kids can basically climb up and look through the periscope eyepieces to see outside. But normally the periscopes would actually retract down into the wells in the deck below. The periscopes also used to turn when the boat first came to the museum, but we've locked them down and strapped up the handles on the sides here so you can't move them anymore. I mean, just imagine that, we don't want kids playing with them anymore, because for one thing, they're actually leaking hydraulic fluid right now, and they're just getting so old. So if these things still turn, you can play with the handles. Imagine you'd be standing here, you'd be getting hit by kids like twirling around on the periscope handles like it's a carousel or a merry-go-round or something. Yeah, it'd be crazy. Now forward here at the front of the control room in the center is the bridge access trunk. This trunk here leads to the top of the sail where the bridge is, and normally the captain or the officer of the deck and a couple of lookouts will be up here, and they're going to be scanning around with binoculars on maneuvering watch when the submarine is on the surface. Now, unlike some other submarines, this is actually not an entrance or an exit to the submarine itself, because there's no way to climb up or down the sail from the outside. Now, some submarines, like USS Bonefish, did have ladder rungs on the outside of the sail to allow you to climb up or down from the bridge, but Blueback does not. Once the submarine goes underwater, then they would come down this ladder, they would seal those hatches, and the men would be in the control room right here. Now, up here on the port side, we have the dive station, or the ship control station, as it's sometimes called. The reason there are two steering wheels here is because the inboard station here on the right is for the helmsman. The helmsman would control the planes on the sail and the rudder so he can make the submarine go left, right, up or down. And the outboard chair there on the left is for the planesman. So he controls the stern planes normally, that is the angle or bubble, the pitch of the boat. Furthermore, the controls there in the center between the two can be used to switch the controls from one station to the other or flip all the controls to a single station if they had to. And up there we have this funny looking L-shaped orange handle. That's actually an auxiliary manual rudder control right there. So in case everything fails. So basically the junior most sailors will be sitting here and all they gotta do is follow orders, look at the controls in front of them, and steer the appropriate course. Because the diving officer is gonna be sitting right behind them, kind of between these two chairs. There's no chair there, but there used to be. Furthermore, back here is actually another backup gyroscopic compass. That is the Mark 27. So sorry kids, no windows, you're not gonna be able to see anything. Between the men too is also an engine order telegraph, that little circular white thing with the dial in the middle of it. So that's where they signal down to the maneuvering room how fast they want to go. Now this orange scroll of paper right here is what we originally thought was a bathythermograph, which would measure water temperature, but as it turns out, upon closer inspection, it's not. We can see down here, according to the plate, that it's an RO192/BQH18 recorder, depth, sound, speed. So essentially what this thing is doing is it's measuring sound velocity through water as a function of depth. Now, sound velocity through water changes depending on pressure, that is depth, temperature, and salinity. Now, the salinity of the ocean doesn't really change all that much unless like you're in the Mediterranean or near some kind of freshwater source like a river. So most of the time they don't really care about that. But a submarine would be interested in how fast sound moves through water, not only in terms of sonar, but in terms of how the boat maintains its buoyancy. So on the scroll of paper, it's pressure sensitive, and the needle here, the stylus, will move up or down as the boat changes its depth, and the paper would scroll left or right as the velocity of the sound changes through the water. So up here on the x-axis, you would have the velocity of sound in, I believe, feet per second, and on the vertical axis, you'd have the depth of the submarine. And also down here at the bottom, on the bottom x-axis, you can't really see it on this scroll of paper, but there would be an equivalent water temperature in degrees as well. Not the actual water temperature from my understanding, but the equivalent water temperature. So based on the curvature of these lines and stuff, you could tell how fast sound is moving through water. The closer to the surface the boat is, then the sub will just feel lighter as it maneuvers around, and the deeper you are, the sub will feel more heavy. So based on the changes in sound velocity through water, they can determine that. And this allows the diving officer, and subsequently the chief of the watch, to trim out the boat and maintain the boat at neutral buoyancy. So that's why that was important. Now, I've talked to a lot of other submarine sailors who have told me that this on their boat was a bathythermograph. So for the sake of argument, let's say that it is a bathythermograph, even though it's not. But a bathythermograph would measure water temperature. Now, a submarine might be interested in water temperature because under certain times of day, depending on the depth of the ocean, where you are, and various other factors, you could dive down and encounter a layer, a gradient, of cold water known as a thermal layer or a thermocline. Sound behaves very interestingly in water. It kind of bends and curves through water. If there's a submarine or a surface ship above you pinging away with active sonar, then a submarine can hide below the thermocline, and some of the active sonar pings would actually bounce off that dense layer of cold water, and the submarine can hide down below it. Furthermore, I mean, the sound can kind of penetrate it, but it might bend through it and spread out. So again, a submarine is capable of hiding below a thermocline to avoid detection. Further back here, we have the ballast control panel, also known as the BCP, the straight board, or the Christmas tree, depending on who you talk to. The Barbel-class submarines are actually the first submarines to introduce push-button and toggle switch controls instead of the knobs and valves for the ballast controls. So you see a bunch of the toggle switches on here. So let me go through this thing kind of section by section and tell you what it is. So here on the left are gauges and controls for the air banks. In the center is the straight board with indicator lights for openings and closing in the hull. The green straight lines means that things are closed. Red circles, on the other hand, will mean things are open. You also have controls for the ballast tank vents, the negative tank, and the main ballast tank blow system. On the right up here are mast controls. So these control all the masts, raise and lower them in the sail with the exception of the periscopes and the snorkel. Below is the snorkel control system as well. And below that are controls for the hydraulic plant on the submarine. There are actually 4 hydraulic plants in the boat. There are 2 main ones, 1 vital one, and the 4th one, which is actually an external plant. In the center at the bottom here, we have controls for the trim system, or of course down here as well, the rheostat for controlling the trim pump. So trim control is done by the chief of the watch. So once the submarine dives down, he's going to use these controls to basically pump water fore and aft and trim out the boat so it's on an even keel. Sailors, on the other hand, throughout other parts of the boat, might be working in a trim party. And they make this guy's job really fun because they're going to run back and forth around the submarine, forcing him to pump water to various tanks to trim things out. So he knows like, oh, we're taking on more weight forward in the submarine, or now it's back and aft in the submarine and something, so he has to use these controls and trim out the submarine. So he's like, what's going on? Until he finally figures it out. So that's a little joke sailors would play on each other on maybe a new chief of the watch here. Now back here, these 2 kind of silver flat switches here are the chicken switches. This is for controlling the emergency main ballast blow system. So this allows the submarine to do an emergency blow. So in the event we need to get to the surface like right now, then we will flip these switches that immediately blows 3,000 psi air into the ballast tanks and the submarine does an uncontrolled ascent. Once you flip these things, you can't really unflip them. There's no stopping you, right? Once you flip them, you're going to the surface whether you want to or not. Again, the movie The Hunt for October demonstrated this, on the submarine, the Dallas anyway, it says emergency blow, and you see a guy in the background, he's actuating the chicken switches, and that's when they blow and go to the surface.
Release countermeasures. Emergency blow. Full rise. Fair water plane. 550. 500 feet. 450.
Come on, Big D.
400
Fly.
So, obviously to be used for emergencies only. Now further back just behind here, we have this red phone. So what on earth would this be used for? Well, for one thing, it has a cipher on it for encrypting a signal, so it's actually for external communication that's secure from the submarine. We like to joke that this is actually the bat phone. It calls Commissioner Gordon's office. And in the very back of the control room here, we have the ECM, or Electronic Countermeasures Space, or actually today it would be more appropriately known as Electronic Support Measures, or ESM. So right there we have the radar scope for the BPS-12 surface search and navigation radar. There are other receivers and oscilloscopes back there that use the ECM masts to intercept, locate, classify, and identify various emissions across the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, submarines, owing to their stealthy nature, are actually very good at picking up the remaining emissions that overt platforms like satellites and aircraft cannot detect. But yeah, those are all basically systems for intercepting things like communications, finding emitters, radars, and so on. So that's the ECM space back there. Now back here, kind of opposite of the ballast control panel, is the navigator's station. So this is a chart table where the navigator and the quartermaster, they're going to tell you where you're going. They're going to use that map there of the ocean. Now, this is a combat submarine. There's no need for windows. For one thing, they're a weak point and they can allow light to escape out of the submarine. The submarine could go down to over 700 feet underwater. There's no sunlight down there anyway. It's below the sunlight zone, so forget about looking for whales and dolphins and fish, kids. If you want fish and whales, go to the Oregon Coast Aquarium if that's what you need. Also, satellite and GPS signals do not penetrate below the surface of the water, so forget about pulling out your phone and using Google Maps for directions. So let me basically talk about submarine navigation from what I know. I'm no expert here, but let me explain kind of how it works on Blueback and how it would find its way underwater. Now, unlike newer submarines, Blueback does not have SINS, or Submarine Inertial Navigation System. There's no ring laser gyros, there's no digital VMS or voyage management systems or anything like that. Blueback had none of that stuff. The Barbel-class was essentially a transitional design incorporating late World War II technology into the early Cold War submarines. Now, I've checked this information with Rick Nolt, a former quartermaster on Bonefish and Blueback, to just make sure it's accurate. So, Blueback could determine its position using visual, celestial, radio, or satellite fixes. It's important to know that a positional fix is not necessarily pinpoint dead accurate, even with today's technology. There will usually be some amount of error depending on the method used. So let me go through some of those methods. Celestial fixes using star, sun, and moon shots could be taken using sextants when the submarine is on the surface, for example, just like the sailors of olden days, right? We saw a sextant back in the captain's quarters. And furthermore, a modified, I think it was an aeronautical sextant, could be attached to the eyepieces of the periscopes. And if they raised up a periscope from periscope depth, they can use that sextant to take, sun and moon shots and star shots as well. This would allow the submarine to take celestial fixes from periscope depths. Now, the accuracy of celestial fixes could be off by several miles or more, so take it with a grain of salt. If we could raise an antenna and use radio navigation to get a fix on our position. You can determine that if you're within range of several LORAN Charlie or LORAN C transmitters. LORAN is an old terrestrial navigation system standing for long-range navigation, but these were ultimately shut down by the US Coast Guard in 2010, I think it was. Now, LORAN fix, if you were in range, could be accurate within about a couple miles to maybe a couple hundred yards. And finally, Blueback had satellite navigation. So satellite navigation was accomplished with transit, also known as NavSat. This was actually the Navy's first satellite navigation system, which was in operation from 1964, and it was eventually replaced, I think, around 1996 or the mid-90s by the GPS system. Now, while GPS, or early GPS, did exist back when Blueback was in service around, the late 1980s, 1990, she never had a GPS receiver. Instead, she used that. Yep. Satellite Navigator, MX1102. That is the receiver for the transit system, for the satellite navigation. So satellite fixes, I've been told, will be accurate from around several hundred yards to maybe a few hundred feet. Now, former quartermaster Rick Nolt told me that he always had trouble getting a LORAN fix on Blueback. He said it sucked. Now, other submarine sailors have told me otherwise. They said, oh, LORAN was great. I could always get a great LORAN fix on my submarine, blah, 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 you know. But Rick told me, oh, God, I hated LORAN. It was never very, reliable on this submarine. So he said he actually had better success with satellite fixes. If they were really good, they could be accurate down to around 50 to a couple hundred feet on Blueback. So, well, that's according to Rick Nolt anyway. Now remember, fixes are not pinpoint accurate. So nowadays, even GPS signals from like your smartphone show your position to within about maybe an arm's length. So it's not like, your phone shows you this is exactly where your big toe is or something, right? It's off by about 3 feet. So anywhere within about an arm's length, that's where your phone will show your position as. So again, there's still error even with modern day smartphones and GPS. Now furthermore, as I said, Blueback did not have submarine inertial navigation systems because there's no accelerometers on this submarine. I confirmed this with former quartermasters. She instead used dead reckoning. Okay, dead reckoning, or deduced reckoning, as it's sometimes called, is pretty basic. You know that you're going on a certain course at such and such a speed for a certain amount of time, and therefore you're going to cover a certain amount of distance. So the dead reckoning system on this submarine would take positional information from the fixes and their speed from the pit sword, and the navigator could plot the position of the submarine and course out on this chart table. There's actually a small light underneath this table that would shine upwards, and it would show you a very, very rough position of the submarine. And this is known as the dead reckoning tracer. So, in fact, if I go over here, I can flip the switch, and you can't see right here. Let me turn to red. I can turn on the light here and show you the light. Yep, it's kind of right there. It's kind of to see. See it? So yeah, that's basically where you would be. Now, every so often, the submarine would actually have to come shallow, raise an antenna or a periscope, and get another fix to make sure they were not drifting off course. Yes, it has happened. If a submarine is navigating improperly, then it can drift off course and hit an underwater obstacle. USS San Francisco in 2005 found this out the hard way when they were running at flank speed and they slammed right into a mountainside, a seamount. Amazingly, the boat did not sink, but there's photos of this and the bow is basically totally crushed. They ended up having to get the bow off of the USS Honolulu when she was decommissioned. Similarly, it happened recently with USS Connecticut, which hit a seamount in the South China Sea as recently as 2021, I believe it was. So again, no windows on the submarine, you wouldn't see anything underwater anyway, so you have to rely on the submarine's navigation system and the charts and the quartermaster and navigator to tell you where you're going. All right, so let's pretend to dive the submarine. So now, again, I'm not a submarine sailor, so let me basically describe to you what I've learned from my colleagues who are former submariners. So let's say we've left Pearl Harbor, okay? We're headed out to sea on patrol, and the navigator reports, we've crossed the 100-fathom curve. There's 600 feet of water beneath the keel. So the diesel engines are shut down and secured. They switch to batteries for their power. The chief of the watch confirms, we have a green board, skipper. All right, so all openings are secured. The officer of the deck says, diving officer, submerge the boat. Make your depth 250 feet, 6-degree down bubble. Chief of the watch announces on the microphone right there for the 1MC. He says, dive, dive, and sounds the dive alarm.
Dive, dive. Dive, dive.
Once the dive alarm sounds, they open the vents. The ballast tanks are flood. The men sitting here at the dive station push forward on the controls, about 6-degree down bubble, and this submarine would be underwater in roughly 1 minute. Once we're at the order depth, they pull back, level off the submarine, and the chief of the watch uses the trim system to trim out the boat. We are now basically very quiet and sticking around underwater. Now we may also do an evolution called Angles and Dangles. We'll put on some more extreme angles on the submarine, and they'll do a series of like kind of high-speed turns to make sure everything is on the boat is secured and it's not sliding around and banging into stuff and create noise. So that's what they can also do. Now we heard the dive alarm, and up here we have a couple more of the ship's alarms. So right up here, this yellow one, this is the general alarm, something that gets kind of annoying after a while, but it means you need to get moving fast.
General quarters, all hands man your battle stations.
Yep, at that point, right, 14 to 17 guys come running in here and they man the various stations around the room. The general alarm is also used for general emergencies and things like that. It could be fires, flooding, or whatever, so it's not just battle stations as well. We also have the collision alarm, something you really don't want to hear.
Rig for collision. Rig for collision.
Now lastly over here, I'm going to talk a bit about the attack center here. So at the very forward here, we have another chart table. It's actually the same thing, I've been told, as the one back there, but the difference is that if they're going to attack a target, then the weapons officer will be standing here at this chart table, and he'll be manually plotting out an attack if the attack center doesn't really work. So US submarines have used that practice for quite some time. They usually manually plot out an attack in addition to using their computers. These two things here are repeaters for pieces of sonar equipment. I'm actually going to go into those when we get down to sonar, so we'll talk about that there. And right here is the attack center. This is the Mark 101 Mod 20 fire control system. It consists of the following. We have the torpedo data computer here, which is the position keeper, this kind of slightly blue lighted window right here. We have the angle solver. Now this torpedo data computer would look extremely similar to something on a World War II fleet boat. It's, for all intents and purposes, kind of the same thing, but it has been updated to accommodate more modern torpedoes, as you see down here, like the Mark 37 and Mark 48. So basically, what this is it's a giant electromechanical analog computer. I don't mean computer like you have at home. If we open this thing up, it's filled with gears and synchros and wires and vacuum tubes. There's no microchips or circuit boards. All this thing does is trigonometry. So what it does is it calculates a firing solution so that when a torpedo is fired, that torpedo will intercept a moving target at a given point in time in the future. So the position keeper here is taking information about our ship's course and speed, and it's looking at inputted information from a target's course, speed, range, and angle in relation to us, and it basically computes where that vessel is in terms of where we are. Now back here we have the angle solver here. This here receives the data from the position keeper and calculates the impact point for the torpedo. Now it also has controls for actually steering modern wire-guided torpedoes with this little black knob right here. Further back right here, let me go over right here. This is the Mark 66 torpedo control console. This allows you to input settings for the Mark 48 torpedo on these various buttons right here. And further down below it, that thing right there is the Mark 47 tone signal generator. Now I've been told, I might be wrong, but what the tone signal generator does is it converts the analog signals into a digital signal, and essentially it's sending the information through a wire directly into the torpedo itself on the fire control solution. And further back here we have the actual firing panel. So using this rotary dial right here, we would set up the order and sequence of fire for the torpedo tubes, and we'd also fire the actual torpedoes from this panel as well. Now, in the event that this panel fails to fire the torpedo, then they would simultaneously fire it from a panel or at the tube itself in the torpedo room, so the system has multiple redundancies. Now, unlike on World War II fleet boats, there's no big red plunger that you push to fire the torpedoes, but it's solely done from this panel here. So lastly right here, these little black knobs here, that's a switchboard, and that one tells you where the torpedo data computer receives information from. Things like bearing and range and stuff. It can get it from the sonar, radar, periscopes, etc. So that's where you control where the system receives information from. All right, folks, well, I think that's gonna do it for the control room here. Let me flip it back to red. And our next stop, we're actually gonna head down that ladder there, and we're gonna talk a little bit about sonar and other things on the submarine. So we're gonna head down from the upper platform deck to the mid deck below. Okay, we have now entered the sonar shack, which was not originally the sonar shack on Blueback, I've been told. This used to be the Chief Petty Officer's quarters, or the goat locker. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So the sonar is the literal ears, and by extension the eyes, of a submarine. We have a series of sounds playing here on loop, and these are recordings of, like, whales and dolphins and ships and submarines that were taken from other submarines as well. So actually, I'm going to turn this off because it's kind of annoying and loud. Yeah, they're just playing on loop from that computer there. Now, there's an entire science and art to sonar and how sound behaves in water. I can't really speak intelligently about it because I'm not a sonar technician, and furthermore, a lot of the information about the capabilities of sonar systems are classified. But sound travels like some 5 times faster through water than air, and often very far. And it's not just dependent on how good your sonar systems are, how quiet your vessel is, and how loud the contact is, but it depends on the environment itself. Things like the sea state, the temperature and salinity of the water, how close you are to the surface and or the bottom. These can affect whether there are things like sound channels, convergence zones, thermal layers, shadow zones, etc. In short, the entire environment affects sound propagation through water and how well your sonar can hear things. Now, if you want to learn about it more in depth, then I suggest you join the Navy and become a sonar technician. Basically, there's 2 types of sonar on submarines, active and passive. Active is that pinging noise where the submarine sends out a ping of sound and it bounces off something and heads back to the submarine. And that's what movies and video games would have you believe that submarines are always using. They're always just going around with their active sonar pinging away at stuff. In reality, it's rarely used because it immediately gives away your position. It's like driving down the highway honking your horn. Everybody knows where you are. Now that said, there are some uses for active sonar. Some types of active sonar can be used to navigate through a minefield if it needed, or maybe under ice if the submarine is traveling in a polar region. A submarine can also send out an active ping to achieve a final range and bearing on a target before firing a torpedo.
Verify our range to target. 1 ping only.
And if enough power is put through an active sonar array, then the sonar system itself becomes a weapon against enemy divers and frogmen. So right over here, we have the console for Blueback's active sonar set. The actual active sonar transducers are located above the torpedo tubes in the front. This is the SQS-49, or sometimes called the BQS-4. This was the first post-war long-range sonar developed for surface ships and submarines by the US Navy. The passive sonar array itself can also be used as a receiver for the active set. Now, documentation on the submarine notes that in active mode, the active sonar set has a range of around 15,000 yards. Over here, this, with the red hand wheel here, this is the console for the passive sonar set. It's a BQR2 Bravo passive set. The passive sonar array transducers are located below the torpedo tubes in front. Documentation on the submarine credits the passive sonar set with a detection range of around 40,000 yards with an accuracy of 0.1 degrees under excellent sound conditions. In 1951, Submarine Development Group 2 reported that the best range for the passive sonar was around 20,000 to 30,000 yards, with an average of about 8,000 yards. This orange circular thing up here is an azimuth indicator for the passive sonar set, so the submarine is right there in the middle where the dot is, and you'd see contacts appear around you. And as you can see right here, we have another recorder there for measuring sound speed through water. And so the red hand wheel on this control console controls where the sonar hydrophone is listening. Above it here, you see a scroll of paper. This is the bearing time recorder. This is essentially an analog version of the modern digital waterfall display. So a stylus on this thing will draw a line showing you the position of a contact over time. So we see here that we have this a contact right here going down here over time. So imagine you spread out the azimuth of something along the horizontal x-axis up here, and time is down here vertically on the y-axis. So up here is the present, down here is in the past. So over time, this contact has kind of gone like that. So it's measuring change in bearing rate over time is what it's doing. Now the bearing time recorder was replaced by something that looks like this. Now movies that actually get submarine sonar actually right, this will look kind of familiar. It's essentially the same thing, but it's digital and it comes in green. This is the waterfall display creating a bearing rate graph. Again, time in this case, here at the bottom, you see it's in 30-minute intervals. And again, on the y-axis with 0 at the top and 30 minutes ago at the bottom. The bearing or azimuth is presented again as a flat line on the x-axis. So right there in the center is 0. That's directly ahead of you. On your direct right is 090, and on your direct left is 270. And directly behind you is 180 on either ends of the graph. Now the curved lines show how much a contact is changing its bearing over a period of time. So if the line is pretty much vertical, then that means the contact has not changed its bearing over X amount of time. And that means it could potentially be on a collision course with you. We have one of those contacts there that's pretty much vertical. That's contact alpha there. And the more horizontal the line is, the more the contact's bearing has actually changed over a shorter period of time. So sonar technicians would obviously be well trained in how to interpret this graph here. And right over here, we have the BQA-8B sonar performance computer, and below it is actually one of the tape recorders. So all the sounds of contacts out there are taped and recorded and analyzed to make sure we know what we're hearing. And in the back here is an interesting piece of equipment. That there is the BQG-2 Bravo passive underwater control sonar receiver. This was originally known as PUFS, or Passive Underwater Fire Control Feasibility Study. The basic idea was that 3 equally spaced hydrophones on the submarine could measure the time that a sound from a contact reached them, and using that difference in time, they could determine roughly the range of that contact. Now, some submarines were fitted with PUFs, which you'll see in pictures. They show like these 3 big hydrophones sticking out of the top of the hull, which kind of resemble big shark fins. Now, one publication I've read said that the Barbel-class were never actually fitted with puffs. So I'm not sure how it worked on this boat, or for all I know, this piece of equipment may not even be original, so who knows. Now, in some submarine movies, you may have heard something called silent running, which is an actual thing to keep the boat quiet and allow sonar to hear better under certain conditions. According to the documentation on Blueback, there are 3 types of silent running on her. So the first is patrol quiet. This is used when the boat is in its patrol area and the equipment is shut down to the extent which would allow normal living conditions. The second is battle quiet, where equipment is secured to the maximum extent and only those who are on watch are up and about. And this means that self-noise should be reduced so that a Mark 37 torpedo's gyro can be heard to power up over the underwater communications set. And lastly, there is sonar quiet, where only equipment that is necessary for the safe operation of the boat is used. And this is to create very quiet conditions for the purposes of sonar recordings. So that basically is a little bit about the sonar equipment on Blueback currently, and about as much as I can speak about it intelligently. So again, I'm not a sonar technician, so I just don't know what this stuff is and really how it works. So that's basically it. So we're gonna head forward now, and we're gonna start making our way toward the torpedo room. So first of all, we're going to stop right here in this passageway. You'll note that here we have a small arms locker. So all warships have lockers for small arms on board, or depending on the size of the vessel, it could be a larger room like an armory. So these would be things like pistols, rifles, shotguns, etc. You may be wondering why on earth a submarine would need small arms. Well, obviously it's for fighting off pirates and terrorists that take over the ship, you know, and we're doing tactical Call of Duty 360 no-scopes, bruh, on the submarine. No, I'm just kidding. So these weapons are providing security when the submarine is in port, and ostensibly for repelling boarders, but they're really just to make sure that no unauthorized people get on board the submarine. However, if you get into a gunfight on a submarine, then something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. They are also for providing force protection when the submarine is on the surface transiting in and out of port. Now, if the submarine surfaces in nice warm waters and the captain is nice, then they might let the sailors do a swim call, in which case a person would be standing topside with a rifle or a shotgun to ward off any sharks that would come their way. And furthermore, submarines that surface from underneath the Arctic ice would have an armed person on lookout for polar bears, because polar bears know no fear. Now, when commissioned in 1959, the small arms lockers would have included 8 Colt 1911 A1 45 caliber pistols, 6 Thompson 45 caliber submachine guns, 3 M1 Garand 30-06 rifles, and 2 Mark V Very pistols and 2 Mark VIII pyrotechnic pistols. And those are essentially flare guns. Now, as Blueback service continued, these weapons eventually changed, and they included things like M14 rifles and 12-gauge shotguns. So up here in this small locker would be the pistols, and there would probably be some pistol belts and ready ammo available, and the long arms would be stored down here in the bottom locker. But all other ammo and the pyrotechnics would be stored down in floodable lockers below in the forward storeroom. So let me open up this hatch here. And I can sort of show you what's down there. So that's the forward stores down there. And as you can see, it's literally just a room filled with little shelves and cubby holes for whatever equipment or food they need to store. And those red lockers down there are the pyrotechnic and ammo lockers as well. And those have heavy steel doors on them, and like I said, they're floodable in the event there's a fire, because you don't want the ammo and the pyrotechnics cooking off. All right, and right up here on the starboard side, we come to the enlisted cruise shower. So there are 2 wash basins in here, and we have 2 showers for 77 enlisted sailors to share. The showers are actually very straightforward on a submarine, but the problem is making enough fresh water. So the 4 freshwater tanks on the submarine can hold a total of about 14,200 gallons. Each of the 2 freshwater stills are theoretically rated to be able to make around 1,000 gallons of fresh water a day, but that's mostly wishful thinking. You'd be lucky to achieve that much. As a result, the submarine will be perpetually rationing fresh water. Now, the cleanest water made by the stills is not for you. In fact, the twice distilled water goes to the batteries. And there's over 300 tons of lead acid batteries below the deck here, going from the ladder we came down from the control room to just about the freezers in the crew's mess. Now, I talked to a former electrician on these submarines, and they told me that the amount of fresh water needed for the batteries is not necessarily a lot, but it needs to be pure. If you put undistilled water in a lead acid battery, you're gonna start having some real serious problems. So after those batteries get the purest water, anything left is used mostly for cooking, drinking, and or cleaning. And then you might have just enough for a luxurious, relaxing, satisfying 1-minute long shower on a submarine. So here's how your shower basically works. You get in the shower, you turn on the water for about 10 seconds, wet yourself down, turn the water off. You're then gonna take your shampoo and soap and lather up and scrub, turn the water back on for about 45 seconds, rinse off, and then you are done. The entire process uses about 3 gallons of water, and if you start doing this at home, I guarantee you your water bill is gonna go down. So those long showers you take at home are known as Hollywood showers, and they are no-go on submarines because they use up too much fresh water. However, if you did a really good job one day, then the captain might be nice and give you an attaboy and allow you to take a Hollywood shower. That being said, it's probably only like a few minutes longer than your average submarine shower, and you certainly wouldn't be in there for like 30 minutes taking your shower, because there'd be like a line of people down the passageway waiting for a shower anyway. Now, depending on who you ask, we've heard from various former crew members on this submarine, and they told us that you'd probably get another shower every 1 to 3 weeks on the submarine. Rick Nolt told me that he usually got a shower about once a month on Bonefish and Blueback. And reportedly, one former crew member said this submarine was out to sea for about 2 months, and they finally got their first shower after about 54 days, so about 7.5 weeks. Well, if it's any consolation, Tony Capitano and Rick Note told me that the water heaters, there were 3 of them on these submarines, they worked, and the showers were actually hot. So there's that. At least you get to take a hot shower. Now here on the other side of the passageway is the enlisted crew's head. That is the toilets. So there's 4 of these toilets in here for 77 enlisted sailors to share. And there are also another 2 wash basins over there. So how do you use a toilet on a submarine? Well, it's kind of a multi-step process. Obviously, you're gonna do your business in the toilet. Then that handle there at the bottom near the floor, you're gonna pull up on that, which opens up the ball valve at the very bottom of the bowl, and that's going to open up to a sanitary tank beneath the heads. So then you're gonna open up that seawater valve back there, and you're gonna use that seawater to flush the contents of the bowl down into the tank. Then you close the ball valve at the bottom, and you close the seawater valve, so you leave a little bit of water in the bowl to form a water seal. And that's basically how it works. And every few days, that sanitary tank below it is gonna be filling up with black water from things like the heads, the showers, the sinks, etc. So it's pressurized with the controls over here in the passageway behind this watertight door right there. And it's going to be pressurized with a 400-pound air line, and the sewage gets blown overboard. Now, a red sign like that, right, secured while blowing sanitaries, that's going to be hung to tell you that that tank is pressurized. But there are many stories of sailors forgetting to hang these signs, or they're ignoring them, and they kind of stumble into the head to use the toilet here. So when they lift up on that handle to open the ball valve, they've created an opening for pressurized sewage to shoot up at them. And they'll spend about 8 or 10 hours cleaning up that smelly, disgusting mess that they just made. Do it once, everybody laughs at you. Do it twice, and you're clearly not learning fast enough. So it pays to read the signs, people. And believe me, we've heard a lot of stories of, this big, yeah, and people stumble out of the head, they're like, oh, they got toilet paper and crap and everything else, in their ears and stuff, and yeah. So read the signs. Isn't that just a nice, charming story, huh? All right, we are now in the torpedo room. This is actually the forwardmost watertight compartment, and it's also actually the smallest watertight compartment. Now, looks can be deceiving. It looks bigger because of the high overheads. That's actually just the pressure hull up there. So let's walk forward. And directly ahead of us are Blueback's 6 torpedo tubes. There are 3 of them at eye level. They're in the bow of the submarine, and there's 3 more below, which are currently shut. Blueback could carry a total of 22 torpedoes, with 6 of them loaded in the tubes and ready to fire. Now, Blueback only carried torpedoes and mines. She could not carry or fire missiles. Now, all these torpedoes that we see in this room are actually real, but don't worry, we've taken the explosives and fuel out of most of them. I think. I'm pretty sure. No, well, contrary to what many people think, the torpedoes are not ticking time bombs. They cannot just decide to spontaneously explode on their own. They have to travel a certain distance before the warhead will even arm itself. And actually, you'd be more concerned in here about a fuel leak from the torpedoes. Now, these torpedoes represent what Blueback carried throughout her 31 years of service. She did not carry all of them at one time. But I'll go into each of them in a few minutes and talk about their specifics. Now, these are heavyweight submarine-launched torpedoes. Some of them weigh over 3,000 pounds. So what happens is, to get them onto the submarine, they're loaded down through this hatch up here, this angular hatch. That's the weapon shipping hatch and also the forward escape trunk, and I'll describe that second purpose in a little bit. But you can see some of the rollers up there where the torpedoes would come down. Now, this gray floor I'm standing on in the middle here is covering this right there. You see, it's a hydraulic lift. So this lift would actually raise up at an angle, catch the torpedo as it comes down, then it's leveled out, it can be moved up and down in this room, then the torpedo is pushed onto the skids here on the sides to stow them. Now, according to the deck logs of the submarine, roughly a dozen weapons could be loaded onto Blueback in about 45 minutes. So it's actually a fairly efficient process because, again, that's the only hatch and deck that it needs to go through. It just needs to come from the top side down into the torpedo room here. On modern subs, the torpedo room is a couple decks down lower in the hull, so it's further behind the sonar dome as well. So loading torpedoes onto those submarines takes more time. Now, to load a torpedo into a tube, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take one of these hydraulic rammers here called a rabbit. You see one attached to the back of this torpedo right here. We attach it to the back of the torpedo, and this is hydraulically operated, so the controls are actually up there. Next to the ladder. So it's going to push the weapon into that 21-foot long tube ahead of us. Furthermore, the rabbit can also be used to extract a weapon from the tube as well. Now, loading a torpedo into a tube with these hydraulic rammers would take maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but I've been told by a former crew member that at full speed, the rammer could push a torpedo into a tube in roughly 10 seconds. Now, that might be an exaggeration. I don't know if that's actually possible. It could also be dangerous because you could damage the weapon or the tube itself. So, yeah, the controls you can see are right there, those little levers there. So let's talk about the various torpedoes in here. There are currently 11 torpedoes on the submarine, and there are 6 different types of torpedoes. Now, if you look up there, this black torpedo up here is what Blueback began her career with in 1959. That is a Mark 14, a remnant of World War II. It's a straight-running, gyroscopically guided anti-surface ship weapon. Anybody who knows about US submarines in World War II knows that the Mark 14s were notoriously unreliable during the war. It's sort of an irony that the fleet boats were such good submarines, and yet they possessed one of the worst torpedoes of any nation during the war. I mean, we could probably spend hours going into all the problems of the Mark 14s, but suffice it to say that these torpedoes were introduced in 1931. They went through very little, if any, testing at all during the development. For example, they were known to run about 10 feet too deep. The top secret magnetic influence exploder at the front was unreliable. It would detonate prematurely before the torpedo reached the target, or it would fail to detonate when the weapon passed underneath its target. The backup contact exploder was too fragile, and it wouldn't detonate when the torpedo actually hit the target, resulting in a dud, because basically the contact exploder head would just smash. And the weapon itself could also run circular. At least 1 or 2 submarines, like the USS Tang in World War II, were sunk by their own circular running torpedoes. I guess the only thing that really reliably worked on the Mark 14 was the alcohol-fueled engine, so at least that actually ran when you fired it. The joke with the 14 was that it would hit the target, fail to explode, back away, apologize, and sink. It only took the Navy until about mid-1943 to finally iron out most of the problems with this torpedo, and eventually it turned into a fairly reliable weapon, which submarines continued to carry throughout the 1970s, believe it or not. Now down here, these other black ones here are Mark 16 torpedoes. The documentation on the submarine noted that we had Mark 16 torpedoes, but I originally could never find them until I looked closely at the stampings and I discovered that these are it. I initially thought these were the Mark 14s, but the only Mark 14 is actually that black one up there. These are the 16s. The Mark 16 is a straight-running, gyroscopically guided anti-surface ship weapon. It was introduced late war, around 1945, but it never saw any actual combat use. It's a high-performance torpedo powered by Naval, which is a concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide. It was very expensive to make, and it had a limited production run. And we only used it until the mid-1970s, like the Mark 14 as well. Now in 1956, we introduced this small green one here. This is a Mark 37 torpedo. It's a battery-powered anti-submarine weapon and was the primary anti-submarine torpedo for a number of years on US submarines. The Navy took these out of service in the 1990s, but some versions were exported and continue to see use in other countries up through the 2000s, I believe. Now, depending on what mod of this torpedo you're using, some versions are wire-guided, but the documentation on this submarine notes that this is actually a mod 3, so it would have active and passive acoustic homing. Now, these worked pretty well, in fact, but until the Soviets began introducing faster and deeper diving submarines. Then their ability to actually catch their target was kind of debatable. Now, one solution for the fast and deep diving Soviet subs was this green torpedo down here, which has the yellow propeller guard back there on it. This is a Mark 45 Astor, or anti-submarine torpedo. As I like to call it, this is the biggest boom in the room. It's the only nuclear-tipped torpedo the US Navy ever fielded, unlike the Soviets, for example, who introduced a number of different nuclear torpedoes, some of which were actually meant to be fired at a port to destroy the port. Now, the Mark 45 is a gyroscopically and wire-guided command-detonated torpedo. It would have an 11 kiloton nuclear warhead in it, and we believe that this small hole up here is actually where the warhead would go. I've been told you can actually make a nuclear warhead fairly small, so that may have been where it was, for all I know. Now, for reference, the little boy bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was around 14 to 15 kilotons. The Mark 45 was purely an anti-submarine weapon. It was only in service from 1963 to 1976, so for about 13 years. There's no acoustic homing, and this weapon could only be command detonated from the firing submarine because the Navy wanted positive human control over the nuclear weapons on its ships. It has a range of about 5 to 8 nautical miles, and the joke with the Mark 45 torpedo here was that it has a blast radius of twice that. So you actually get to destroy 2 submarines with one of these. The submarine you shot it at and your submarine itself. Again, that's a joke. Now, in reality, I've been told that the water around the torpedo would actually absorb a lot of the blast of the nuclear detonation. Now, we abandoned the Mark 45 after 13 years since the utility of destroying another submarine with a tactical nuclear weapon was dubious at best, shall we say. Some of these, I've been told, were actually converted to conventional freedom torpedoes, quote unquote, and they were exported to other countries. Our examination of Blueback's deck logs leads us to believe that she likely did carry some Mark 45s while doing special operations in 1967. We do know that she actually fired some exercise Mark 45s while doing workups prior to heading to Yankee Station off Vietnam in June of that year. So we believe she may have also laid some mines off Vietnam at that time as well. Now further back here, behind the Mark 45, right here, we have a funny orange torpedo. This is a dummy torpedo. It's a completely inert practice torpedo. It's used to test systems on the submarine, like, for example, to make sure the torpedo tubes can still work and fire a torpedo. So these can also be used in exercises so as to avoid wasting a war shot, a live weapon, which you see up there. You see the signs that say war shot loaded. So that way you don't have to actually kill friendlies. So this dummy torpedo here would actually travel a certain distance, and they would run out of fuel and basically float to the surface when they could be recovered. Now, in the absence of these, a charge of seawater, known as a water slug, could be fired from the torpedo tube to simulate firing a torpedo, as well as during exercises. So, for example, let's say a friendly submarine is doing an exercise with a carrier group and they're hunting the carrier, and they'd fire a water slug and then they'd fire off a flare to signal that they sank the carrier. It's like cops and robbers, right? Saying, bang, we got you, you're dead. Now around 1972, we replaced all of these torpedoes in this room with this big green torpedo up here on the left. This is a Mark 48. This is currently the only heavyweight submarine launched torpedo in service with the United States Navy today. It's an anti-submarine and anti-surface ship weapon with wire guidance as well as acoustic active and passive homing capability. And when it fires, this can back here will remain in the tube and spool out about 10 miles of wire which can be used to guide the torpedo to the target with the fire control system. There would also be a torpedo-mounted wire dispenser fitted here over the pump jet, so we believe it doubles the length of the wire to around 20 miles. I've actually found half of this wire dispenser, but I cannot find the other half, so hence why it's not currently displayed on our submarine. Now the top speed and range of the Mark 48 is actually classified, but unofficially, we believe it's greater than 55 knots and greater than 20 miles. But again, those are unofficial figures. The Navy won't actually say. So if we look up here, we can see that officially the range is 10,000 plus yards at 28 knots, and her top speed is officially greater than 28 knots. So, but in any case, it's basically still classified. Now, when they entered service, the Mark 48 was just under $1 million per, but nowadays it's something like $4 or $5 million. And I believe they're doing some studies to try and figure out a way to lower the cost of these torpedoes, because these things are expensive. I believe modern modifications of this torpedo use fiber optic cable, plus it's a two-way communication between the torpedo and the firing submarine, so the torpedo itself kind of acts as an off-board sensor. When it's fired, it can tell the submarine what it hears in front of it. The wire guidance on this torpedo also means that the firing submarine can use its more powerful sonar to track the target, and we can update the torpedo with different attack profiles and change the targeting information on the torpedo in real time. Also, when it's under wire guidance, nothing can actually decoy the torpedo. Now, if the wire gets cut or if it breaks, the torpedo can activate its onboard sonar and search around for its target. It also has re-attack capabilities, so if it misses the target, it can circle around and attack it again. Now, the Mark 48 torpedo doesn't actually hit its target. What it does is it goes underneath its target, let's say a surface ship, and it detonates a 650-pound PBXN explosive warhead. This essentially creates a massive void in the water. Here's a picture of a sink exercise being performed on a former US Gearing-class destroyer. It's literally lifting this ship, it weighs about 3,000 tons, out of the water, breaking the keel, and then the collapsing void beneath it means the ship essentially folds itself in half as it falls into the hole in the water. And just one of these torpedoes basically snapped this ship right in half. Now, Blueback herself was never actually in combat. During her service, the last time a US Navy submarine fired a torpedo in anger was on 14 August 1945. The USS Torsk sank a couple of Japanese ships in the Sea of Japan, literally the day before the Japanese surrendered and World War II ended. It would only be over 80 years until 3 March 2026 when a US submarine again sank an enemy ship when USS Charlotte fired a Mark 48 torpedo and sank the Iranian frigate Dana in the Indian Ocean. So let's say we're going to fire a torpedo. Here, let me climb up here behind this ladder. Now the tubes here are actually numbered number 1, number 2, number 3 down below, number 4 down below, and number 5 here on the center line, and number 6 down below there on the center line. Now on either side of this room, you see this big kind of silver cylinder right there? That's one of the hydraulic ejection cylinders. The starboard cylinder here controls tubes 1, 5, and 3, the starboard tubes, and the other one on the other side controls the other tubes, the port side tubes. Now there's an interlock system, meaning that we can only open one torpedo tube per cylinder. So essentially we can only fire 2 torpedoes at a time. Now once a torpedo is loaded into a tube, we get a good firing solution from the computer. What we're going to do is we're going to seal this breech door here in this room for the torpedo tube. We flood the tube with water from the water-round torpedo or WRT tank. We equalize pressure with the ocean, and then we open the outer door, the muzzle door at the other end there. That's the only thing that's holding back the Willamette River right now. Now when a torpedo is fired, the ejection cylinder forces a 3,000-pound slug of pressurized seawater from the impulse tank into the tube, and it fires the torpedo out. The system is designed to eject a torpedo out at about 23 knots, or roughly 27 miles per hour. So this submarine uses water slugs, not pressurized air, to fire a torpedo from its tube. This way there's not a big plume of bubbles coming out every time we fire a torpedo. So now we just gotta find the nubs and send them looking for the serial numbers on the water slugs. Now when the torpedo leaves the tube, the torpedo's motor will then activate and propel the weapon toward the target. The torpedo's motor can either be electrically or mechanically started as well. Now when the order is given to fire, for example, they've said match bearings and shoot, the torpedo is fired from the panel in the control room like we saw up there, and it'll sound a little something like this. Bullseye, we just destroyed the enemy submarine. Well, more than likely, we just destroyed the bridge in front of us. Actually, I'm joking. If you can hear the torpedo explosion from inside the submarine, then you are way too close. Now, what that sound was, I've been told, is actually the water being drained from the tube. Because firing that torpedo means we've lost about 3,000 pounds of weight on the submarine. So we have to compensate for that by draining the water from the tube here with a 400-pound airline into an auxiliary tank below these tubes. And that's what that sound is at the end. So once empty, we equalize the pressure in that tube and we vent the air from the tube back into the boat itself. And reportedly that creates a very loud hissing noise, I've been told. Now, if the panel in the control room fails to fire the torpedo, it can also be fired from a panel in here, like I showed you. And also, on the side of these torpedo tubes is a manual valve to manually fire the torpedo tube if all those systems fail as well. So essentially, it's a triple redundant system. That's basically how a torpedo is fired. All right, let's head back down here now. All right, now, if we look above our heads here, we see we have some bunks or racks. Any space not occupied by a torpedo means that they can lay down mattresses and create sleeping berths known as skid racks in here. I actually made a video on this channel about those previously. So this is usually overflow berthing. We have another one actually over here on this side, and there's another one on the other side over there. Now, a lot of sailors actually like sleeping in the torpedo room. If you're lucky, you'll get a space in here. The reason why is because it's heavily air conditioned in here, there's more room to actually stretch out, and you would have your own bunk. Plus, the torpedoes don't normally snore. So you might get lucky and be able to sleep in here, provided that you're comfortable sleeping next to tons of explosives. So Rick Nolt, who served on this submarine, told me that the top torpedo skids actually cannot support the weight of a Mark 48 torpedo. So they usually go to sea with fewer than 22 torpedoes, let's say about like 18 or thereabouts. And they would simply use the top skids here for skid racks. Now, Blueback may also have some other riders on board the submarine, such as special ops guys. These could be like Neil here, the SEAL. They could have Navy SEALs, they could have Recon Marines, or even Army Special Forces, Green Berets. In 1979, we do know that Blueback actually did an exercise with Army Green Berets. So we have Neil over here. He represents the SEALs and what they would wear roughly in the 1970s here. So Blueback could covertly deploy special ops guys into enemy territory using her forward escape trunk up there where we load the torpedoes, like I said, as a lockout chamber. So she would come up to about 60 feet underwater. The guys would climb up in there, 2 or 3 guys at a time, seal the inner door, flood that chamber, equalize the pressure, and swim out. Then they head ashore. Whatever they do after that is classified. So we'll come back a few days later and pick them up the same way they went out. And no, we do not shoot the special ops guys out the torpedo tubes. Just torpedoes, or occasionally bratty, misbehaving children. But we haven't done that in days. No, I'm kidding. Now, some foreign submarines, I've been told, do use the torpedo tubes as well as lockout chambers for special ops guys to egress from their submarine, but they're not actually shot out of the tubes. Nowadays, the Virginia-class attack submarines and some of the Ohio-class submarines have much larger lockout chambers that can accommodate entire SEAL teams, so it's much more efficient. For example, the Ohio-class submarines, some of their missile tubes have been converted to big lockout chambers as well. Now, as I mentioned, that up there is also the forward escape trunk. If this submarine were to sink in about 300 feet of water, then to get out of the submarine, you would have to don one of these large orange stanky hoods. Now, it has a funny name, but it's basically a life preserver with a hood on it. It gets its name from its inventor, Lieutenant Harris Stanky. The Stanky hood actually replaced the Momsen lung, and they were in turn replaced in the 2000s by submarine escape immersion equipment, which are actually full body suits that can be used down to around maybe 600 feet. So what you do is you get on your Stanky hood, you climb up into the escape trunk, a few guys at a time, then you'd flow that chamber and swim out, remembering to exhale and say ho, 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 all the way up. If you do not exhale on the way up as you rise to the surface, you're going to become familiar with Boyle's Law. As you rise to the surface, the gas in your lungs will expand because the outside pressure is decreasing. So if you attempt to hold your breath when you rise from that depth, your lungs are going to explode. That's called barotrauma, and it's not fun. When you go through submarine school, you practice submarine escapes in a water tank. They used to look like these big 100-foot water towers here. And I think there was one in Pearl Harbor and there's one in Groton, Connecticut at the submarine school as well. But the Navy no longer uses these. I think these have been replaced now with 40-foot tanks. Now this black mask over here with the long hose attached to it is known as an EAB, or an emergency air breather mask. If there's a fire or a toxic atmosphere on the submarine, then you have to get these on. You plug into these red manifolds up here. These will usually be in just about every room on the submarine, so you can breathe. Now the EAB system on the Blueback was retrofitted onto it sometime in the 70s, we think, so it's not original. So you would need to know by touch where all of these manifolds were. And usually on the deck here, there's a piece of rough textured tape on the deck, so you can feel that with a gloved hand if you're crawling along the deck. You know that directly above that is one of the manifolds up there. So as Rick Nolt's experience during the Bonefish fire indicates, a major fire on board will instantly fill the sub with thick black smoke, and you will be dead in minutes if you breathe this. You wouldn't be able to see anything, not even your hand in front of your face. So you get on your EAB mask, you plug into the manifold, and you'd breathe. If needed, you can actually daisy chain these together because on the hose is a regulator and you can plug into another person's regulator. You can kind of see it right there, that connection right there. So you can daisy chain them together if there's not enough manifolds for you to plug into. Now this black mask right here is not scuba gear, it's an oxygen breathing apparatus, or an OBA. Unlike the EAB mask, which essentially tethers you to the manifold, this allows you to breathe and move around more. Inside the center compartment there is a canister of potassium superoxide that scrubs CO2 and generates oxygen when you breathe into it. And there are bladders on the side of this which will inflate to cool that air before you breathe it into your lungs. There's also a 1-hour timer on this thing, but normally I've been told you'd set it to around 45 minutes to allow time to change the canister or to evacuate if needed. These in turn were replaced in the 2000s by self-contained breathing apparatuses, or Scott packs, you know, like the kind that firefighters use today. Now generally this submarine could stand underwater with the available oxygen on board for about 4 or 5 days, so I've been told. But over here, next to Neil, those pipes and valves right there, is the bleed air oxygen system. There are 3 flasks of emergency oxygen of 4.5 cubic feet of oxygen pressurized to 2,265 psi available. So we can use this system here to bleed the oxygen into the atmosphere of the submarine and extend its breathable air. On the other side of the room over here, we have these cans. This is lithium hydroxide, or CO2 absorbent powder. So what you do here is you would empty the powder into this hopper here and run this machine, and that will scrub out some of the CO2 from the air that you're exhaling. And I've been told they would carry around 3 days worth of this stuff. If needed, they could also just open up the cans themselves and spread the powder around manually. Now another thing to note is that Blueback herself has no ability to generate her own oxygen, either through electrolysis or with oxygen candles or anything like that. She also has no amine, or monoethanol amine, CO2 scrubbing system on her. So every so often, we will get sailors from modern submarines come on board and they say like, oh hey, I could still smell the amine on the submarine. No, there's no amine on this submarine. There never was. That's not amine you're smelling, that's diesel. That's a diesel boat you're smelling. All right, so I think that pretty much describes most of the things that are interesting in here in the torpedo room. So we're gonna head back out through this watertight door, and our next stop will be the crew's quarters. Okay, so we are now in the crew's quarters, or enlisted berthing. In Blueback's day, submarines usually operated on an 18-hour day divided up into 3 6-hour watches. So yes, they literally cut 6 hours out of the day because you don't see the sun, so your circadian rhythms no longer matter. So you're basically walking around sleep deprived all the time. The way it works is the third of the crew is normally up on watch at any given time, another third is off watch doing maintenance, repairs, studying, having some free time, etc. And the last third will be down here sleeping. Around 2015, US submarines switched to a 24-hour day broken up into 3 8-hour watches to allow sailors to get more sleep. Now this specific area that we're in is known as the Chief Petty Officer's quarters, or the goat locker. Now the Chief Petty Officers are senior enlisted men. They have been in the Navy long enough to have earned their own sleeping space and their own space for themselves. As you see, we've converted one of the racks here as a display for donated materials from former sailors. So, heading further aft here, I can describe that the berthing area is actually divided up into three kind of sections, you might say. We're currently standing on what is known as First Street on the starboard side of the vessel. And here in the middle is Main Street, which is the main passageway that connects the forward part of the submarine to the aft part of the submarine. And over here, we have Second Street. And here on the port side is Third Street. Now, for the 77 enlisted sailors on the submarine, there are 66 racks, or bunks, if you want to call them that. If you're new to the submarine and enlisted, you will be sharing your bunk. Here's how it works. After you sleep for those 6 hours, you're going to get woken up to go on watch. And by the time the next guy crawls into the bunk, it's still warm from your body heat. That's known as hot racking or hot bunking. Now realistically, it works out to like 3 men per 2 racks based on the rotation. I've been told on modern submarines in the US Navy, even attack submarines, they usually, not always, but usually, have enough bunks for the entire crew so they don't have to hot rack anymore. Interestingly, talking to Tony Capitano, who served on USS Barbel, he said he never had to hot rack on Barbel. So he got pretty lucky. Now these bunks here are all the same size. They are 6 feet 2 inches long, 2 feet wide, and there's 18 inches of clearance between them. You might be wondering if there's a height restriction on submarines. Technically, yes, but no. The tallest sailor on Blueback, I've been told, was 6'8". He volunteered, just like everybody else. I don't know why, but he did. There was even a guy temporarily assigned to the submarine who was 6'11", I've been told. So I think the catch is that if you're taller than 6'8", you have to like sign a waiver saying that you won't hold the Navy liable for all the head injuries you're about to incur on the submarine. Or put another way, I think another restriction is there's a girth restriction. You gotta fit through a 25-inch diameter hatch to get in and off the submarine. So let me put it this way. If you can't stand up straight, tough. Deal with it. You asked to be on a submarine. And modern submarines do have a little bit higher overheads. There's a bit more headroom, but not necessarily a lot more headroom. So still, you might be crouching in places. So if you're too tall to stand up straight, deal with it. But if you can't fit through a hatch, especially to get in and off the submarine quickly in an emergency, you have now become everybody's problem. Now the racks open up like this one to reveal a 4-inch deep storage space below them for all your personal possessions. And if you're hot racking, you will be sharing this space as well. Now this submarine could be out on patrol at sea for anywhere from a few weeks to up to 3 months. So imagine spending 90 days inside a steel tube with 85 people and no contact with the outside world. So there is no sunlight, there's no internet, there's no screens, streaming services, social media, video games, or DoorDash. Parents ready to sign your kids up yet? Now, every 18 to 24 months, the Blueback might be deployed on what's called a WestPac, or Western Pacific Patrol. And this could be anywhere from 4 to 6 months away from your home port. You'll pull into various ports on WestPac, you'll see different sites of the world, but basically you'll be out at sea, you'll reprovision eventually, and you'll come back to your home port after maybe 4 to 6 months. Now, a lot of people ask what this kind of open space is here. So, well, this is the bowling alley, it's the tennis court, the soccer pitch, the dance hall, multi-purpose recreational room right here. No, I'm just kidding. There actually used to be 6 bunks right where we were standing here, but we took them out so we have a place for tourists to stand. You actually can still see where the air conditioning vents are as well. Yeah, and the rack lights up here. So, some people ask what this is. This is a, I believe it's a sounding station for the fuel, to test and measure the fuel in the ballast tanks. Another thing I'll say is that a former crew member has told me that the AC system on the Barbel boats worked very well and it kept the sub at a very comfortable temperature. Rick Nolt told me that they actually would have to wear like jackets or sweatshirts in some places, you know, like the control room or the maneuvering room, just to keep warm, because there'd be so much AC blowing into these spaces throughout the submarine, so it actually was comfortable. So it's not like an older World War II fleet boat where it would just be like swelteringly hot and humid and all that. So he told me that the air conditioning system on these submarines worked about 80% of the time. Of course, the 20% of the time that they didn't work, then it was kind of miserable. Now, I've already talked about the showers and limited fresh water, but in addition to the body odor of 85 dudes, about 75% of the crew smoked on board. So, you see the right up here. Yeah, there we go. There's a pack of cigarettes right there. And even if you don't smoke, you still smoke. If you don't smoke, even better. You just buy a bunch of cartons of cigarettes, and when the guys who do smoke run out of cigarettes, you just sell those cigarettes at markup. So you make a little money off of it as well. So in addition to all that, you've got the smell of diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, lubricants, various tanks and bilges, and no laundry facilities whatsoever. Now in today's submarines, you'd have one of these pair of Navy coveralls. This is your daily working uniform known as a poopy suit. So you wear these things forwards, backwards, and inside out for weeks at a time until they stand up on their own. You just wake up every day, put on your cleanest pair of dirty clothes. From my understanding, poopy suits originally started on ballistic missile submarines, boomers, but they eventually made the transition over into attack boats, so they're now pretty much standard on most submarines. However, the photographic evidence that I've found on Blueback and the former crew I've talked to say that they actually would wear dungarees on Blueback. That's the light blue chambray shirts and the bell-bottom trousers. Now right over here is your laundry bag. Your dirty clothes goes in there. Then when you get back to port, you take that bag full of dirty laundry ashore, and then you can either get it cleaned, you can burn it, and or bury it. Your choice. So what you cannot tell from this video is the smell of the submarine. It's 31 years of all of those malodorous things, and we will never get rid of it. It is with us forever. Now you'd call it stinky, but honestly, I just call it history. Submarine history. Now, we've technically been airing the submarine out since we got her in 1994, so just imagine what Blueback smelled like when we got her back then. Oof. Now, modern nuclear-powered submarines do have it better. On nuclear-powered subs, showers are usually every day. There is a washer and dryer for your clothes, and the Navy actually got smart and they banned smoking on submarines really early, sometime in the year 2010, I've been told. Then the following year, they got progressive, and they started allowing the first women, that is, the first officers, on US submarines, followed by the first female enlisted a couple years later. So today women are serving on both attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines, so standards have improved. And from what I've heard, around 2028, they're hoping to have their first female submarine captain. So yeah, they are making quite a bit of progress. But of course, you know, the problem is that a lot of submarines, they had to be retrofitted with separate berthing, showers, and heads for the women. Yeah, it took them a long time to get women on board submarines. So that was one issue. And of course, there is a incident out there where some sailors put some cameras in the women's shower or their heads or something or whatever. So yeah, that did not end very well for those guys. All right, so let's move forward here. Or sorry, I should say aft. So this here is the battery well. This is access to the battery wells below. As I mentioned, there are over 300 tons of lead-acid batteries that power the entire submarine underwater. So down there are 504 cells divided up into 2 battery wells. So there are 252 cells each, and the battery cells are wired up in series in each of the wells. So right here, below this hatch, is the forward well that goes from here forward to just past the stairs, the ladder that we came down from the control room. And the aft well goes from here to back where the freezes are behind those stairs over there in the crew's mess. So what would happen was an electrician on the submarine would crawl down there and refill those lead acid batteries down there with the all-important distilled water. He'd probably come out with acid burns on his poopy suit from the sulfuric acid in the batteries. They would also monitor the hydrogen coming off the batteries themselves because concentrations higher than about 3%, I think, creates a serious explosion hazard. Furthermore, obviously you do not want seawater getting down into the battery wells because that can create chlorine gas, which is deadly, and you can start a serious electrical fire. Case in point, USS Bonefish in 1988, she had a leaking seawater valve from her trash disposal unit, and water got down there and started a huge fire. You can see my video and blog post where I interviewed Rick Nold about his experiences on Bonefish during that fire in 1988. As you can see, we have our chief electrician down there. He's currently working on the batteries. He just keeps going and going and going, and honestly, he's just the hardest working crew member we got, so yeah, more power to him. All right, now here on the right, we actually have a model of one of Blueback's battery cells. Now each of the battery cells, as you see here, is about 1 foot by 1 foot by 4 feet tall and weighs about 1,200 pounds, or I've been told roughly the size of a 1-year-old baby elephant. And each of them produces just under 2 volts. The cells themselves are actually wired up in series, and they produce a total of about 1,000 volts and roughly 5,400 amps. And as you can see here, we have a small AA battery there, just for scale. So that's how big one of the cells is on the submarine. Now here we have now entered the crew's mess. This is essentially their living room. As we saw the wardroom above us, that's for the officers, and this space is for the 77 enlisted sailors. So basically, if you're not sleeping or on watch, then you're gonna be in here. It's one of the only places where you can come to actually sit down and relax And it's where you would have all your meetings, your trainings, classes, studying, free time, even religious services, and of course, eating. Now again, these stairs here are not original to the submarine. These are put in as a convenience for you and me. So there used to be another 6-man table here, just like this one, where the stairs are. So we have 2 6-man tables, 2 4-man tables there outboard. So a total seating of about 20. The backs of these benches have these little trays in here. These would store condiments, you know, ketchup, mustard, stuff like that. And the tabletops used to have backgammon and checkerboards on them. So they'd play card tournaments, they'd play hearts, spades, poker, cribbage, acey-deucey, etc. Now obviously you're not going to fit all 77 enlisted sailors in here at once, so the meals would last roughly 1 hour. They rotate 20 guys at a time here, with about 15 to 20 minutes to eat before they need to move out for the next group of guys. Now the first group to eat will be the ongoing watch. They move out, and then is the off watch. And lastly, by the time that they're done, the now relieved off-going watch comes in to eat. Much of the food is served family style, so for breakfast they would have like big bowls of scrambled eggs and hash browns and sausage going around. You just take what you want. And that table there in the back corner is known as starvation table. Now there might be some food left when it gets around to them. Now right over here as we entered, where we have our mock-up battery, this is not the galley, this is the scullery. So yes, no food is made in here, even though it has lots of stainless steel. Now if you're the newest enlisted sailor on the submarine, brand new to the Navy, new to the submarine, then you're gonna spend your first 3 months working here in this scullery. You get to crank, or mess crank. And this means you get to scrub the dishes and all the pots and pans by hand. There's no dishwasher, that's you. You'll peel potatoes, you'll take out the trash, cut up the vegetables for the salads, you're gonna do the prep work, you're gonna assist the cooks, fetch and stock food, you're gonna serve people meals, and you're gonna keep the crew's mess clean. You'll be working here, for example, and someone out in the crew's mess is gonna yell, "Hey, Crank, get out here!" So you run out here and say, "Yeah, what do you need?" You say, "Get me more food." So you run up here and get them more food from the galley, right? Whatever they want, until someone else yells for you, "Hey, Crank, get out here!" So it's not a very fun job, but here's the thing, you're not qualified. You don't have your dolphins for this submarine. You just got here. It's basically the final litmus test by the crew to see if you have the proper work ethic and attitude that they demand for you to be here. If you can't handle washing dishes, which is like the easiest job on the submarine, then you are not going to be trusted with the more important jobs on the submarine. So when they pull into port, then the crew will literally unvolunteer you and send you back to the surface fleet. You will never be allowed on submarines again. So if you're one of those people who is so full of themselves that washing dishes and doing the grunt work is beneath you, then, well, you better become an officer so you don't have to crank. But even then, junior officers who are nubs still get demeaned in their own way. Yeah, junior officers would do well to just shut their mouths and listen to the chiefs. Remember, everybody volunteers to be on a submarine, so you have to demonstrate that you actually want to be here. So this is where you're going to be working for a while if you're an enlisted sailor. Now, trash is disposed of in the garbage disposal unit back there, that kind of vertical white tube. So basically, it's a downward-facing torpedo tube, but not really. Now back in the day before environmental laws changed, roughly in the 1970s, everything on the submarine went overboard. Nowadays, anything non-biodegradable gets smashed down in a compactor and stored until the submarine gets back to port. So for example, modern submarines, they'll take any like plastics and stuff like that, they'll put it in this heater which will melt the plastic down into this like dinner plate sized disc, and they store those until they can get back to port and get rid of them. Now the biodegradable trash goes into a can that looks kind of like that. So they come flat like that, and then they're folded into shape like that. So we have to put our garbage in there. You weigh the can to make sure it weighs about 56 pounds or thereabouts. Otherwise, we stick one of these big iron TDU weights in there. That way it does. Now, a funny story about those TDU weights is that I've read a story from a submarine sailor who said they took a bunch of those and they started putting them underneath the mattress of a new junior officer who the enlisted sailors did not particularly like. And basically what it is that the mattress is sat into a pan in the rack. So eventually that rack got heavier to lift up to get into the locker beneath the rack. And they got up to like 30 of those weights in there until eventually he literally couldn't lift it up. And it took him like a couple weeks to figure out what the heck was going on. So yeah, the enlisted sailors will find ways to get back at the officers that they're not fond of. Anyway, we're gonna stick one of those TDU weights into that can to make sure it's heavy enough. We take the can, load it into the trash disposal unit in the scullery, and then we eject it out of the bottom of the submarine. And no, we do not care what happens to it, as long as it doesn't float to the surface and give away our position. So if this boat is operating in a highly sensitive area, then they actually won't eject anything overboard. Now the can itself, I'm pretty sure, is just non-galvanized tin, so it'll rust away in seawater after a while. It leaves the weight at the bottom, and the rest becomes fish food. So if anybody has seen the 1958 film Run, Silent, Run Deep with Burt Lancaster and Clark, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, Gable, there's a subplot in that movie of this US submarine operating in the Pacific in World War II, and they're not weighing down their trash properly when they give it the float check. So what happens is a Japanese submarine is coming along and picking up this trash and gaining intelligence off of it. Hence why you need to make sure your trash is properly weighed and loaded down when you eject it out of the garbage disposal unit there. Now this right here is the galley. Yep, that's it, the entire kitchen for the submarine. No, it does not get any bigger than this. It's about the same size as a World War II fleet boat's galley. Now modern submarines do have larger galleys because they have larger crews and they have more of a need for being efficient. Now this is small, but it is an industrial kitchen. It's designed to feed many people. In the galley is one sink, one electric range, one toaster, one 12-quart mixer with a bowl that's actually too small for it right there, 2 ovens down there, 2 waffle irons back there, and 1 deep fat fryer back kind of where that apron is hanging there. So submarines in the United States Navy are the only naval vessels still allowed to have deep fat fryers, even though they're a huge fire hazard, because good food is such a huge morale factor. They're literally willing to risk burning the place down just so they can get their jalapeno poppers and their wings. Now all the cooking equipment in here is electric. Having a gas range is not a good idea on a submarine. Now there would be about 3 to 4 cooks on board rotating through the galley, roughly 1 guy at a time, and they would make 4 meals a day for the entire 85 men on board. Now from my understanding, I recently talked to a culinary specialist on submarines who served on Jimmy Carter, and she told me that the current training for a culinary specialist, their A school, is about 1 month long. And really what it is to teach you the basics of food handling and storage safety, how to use the equipment in the galley, and how to make food that's not going to kill someone with food poisoning. Most of the cooking, she told me, is they actually learn out in the fleet once they get to a submarine. And as they advance throughout their career and climb higher and higher up, then eventually they may be selected for about a 2-month-long culinary school. So they're pretty much chefs when they're done with them. When many of the culinary specialists leave submarine service, they go on to serve and work in fancy hotels and restaurants throughout the world. And I've also been told usually one of the White House cooks is a former submarine cook. So that's how well these people are trained in cooking. Now each meal is designed to be 6 hours apart. Breakfast is at 0600, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800, and at midnight we have midnight rations or midrats. That's basically leftovers or soup or sandwiches or whatever the cook wants to make that night. Now, submarine food is actually known to be the best in the entire US military, not just the Navy. So to give you some examples, this menu here is from Blueback from October of 1970, the week of the 26th. So if we look at Monday for breakfast, I mean, as you can see, it was pretty rough. The standard breakfast included chilled fruit juice, chilled fruit, fresh milk, bread, butter, jam, assorted breakfast pastries, fresh eggs to order, home fried potatoes, golden pancakes, grilled bacon slices, and hot maple syrup. Dinner, right, what they used to call lunch, was worse, I'm afraid. They were making them eat baked meatloaf, creamy mashed potatoes, gravy, buttered broccoli, hot rolls, fresh garden salad, and assorted cake and ice cream. And supper, or dinner, was the worst. It was baked ham, candied sweet potatoes, pineapple raisin sauce, club spinach, and ice cream sundaes. I particularly like Tuesday's lunch there. We got prime roast beef, mashed potatoes, natural gravy, buttered green beans, and pound cake and ice cream for dessert. So yeah, they really tortured them with the food. I mean, they were forcing them to eat horrible things like hamburgers and hot dogs and pizza and pasta and pancakes, waffles, French toast, even steak and lobster. It was rough. The midnight cook, of course, is the baker. Now he's gonna make the fresh breads every night. He's gonna make the donuts, the cookies, the cinnamon rolls, sticky buns, pies, brownies, even your birthday cake. And yes, even like the pizza dough and the hamburger buns and all that, those are made from scratch. And all meals in the Navy have a dessert, even breakfast. So, you know, your breakfast would have like cinnamon rolls or something. It was tough. In addition, they'd also have special meals. Like, for example, right here is the plan of the day for the 4th of July of 1963. As you can see, they've got like, you know, shrimp cocktail and French onion soup, grilled loin steak, mashed potatoes, you know, various kinds of carrot sticks and veggies and stuff like that. Cherry pie with whipped cream, with a fresh made whipped cream, not a non-dairy substitute. Good stuff right there. Over here we have the Thanksgiving dinner for some time in Blueback service. We have no idea when, but yeah, of course you'd have special holiday meals, the turkey, the stuffing, all the sides and all that, the whole thing. And of course, no dessert is complete without cigarettes and cigars down there, because remember, everybody smoked pretty much on the submarine. Now, most of the submarine sailors are going to tell you that the food was excellent. Now, on ships and submarines, some days are reserved for certain meals. For example, every Friday is surf and turf, so there's going to be steak and some kind of sea creature like shrimp, crab, lobster, whatever. About halfway through the patrol, you're probably going to have steak and lobster. Every Saturday would be pizza night, so there'd be pizzas going around here. Sundays might be like cheeseburgers and wings and, you know, chocolate chip cookies, just to give some examples. And the meals are on like a 3 to 4 week rotation. So about every 21 to 28 days, you're gonna come around to the same meal again. But of course, there are some outliers. Some say that the quality of the food goes down the further into the patrol that you are. I have also heard some instances of botched meals, and the crew will let the cooks know, because there's no place to hide on a submarine. If you burn the chow, everybody's gonna be pissed. So for example, I heard of one story of one cook on a submarine who accidentally used salt instead of sugar to make the pancakes. I've also heard another story of another breakfast which featured rehydrated cottage cheese, which is as disgusting as it sounds. Yeah, the crew promptly spat that back out, so those were not popular breakfasts. I've also read a story from roughly the 1950s of a quote-unquote Greenwood's Chinese special, which supposedly was chow mein, I think, but it's anybody's guess as to what it really was. So, but it was supposed to be Chinese food or something. Now, the problem on the submarine is food storage. We have to find space on this boat to store some 14 to 16 tons of food for 60 days normally, but there'd be an extra 30 days of food if the patrol gets extended. So 90 days of food total at sea before they need to pull into port and replenish food. Now, as we've seen, there's not much space on the submarine, and the submarine can't just pull into Costco or up alongside a supply ship and do an underway replenishment or an unrep at sea. It's not designed for that. I do know some submarines that have experimented with vertical replenishment or vert rep with like drones and helicopters, but it's very, very limited and it's not very efficient. So right over here, we have the two 75 cubic foot freezers slash coolers for the cold stuff that can be converted either way. We have a couple of storage rooms. One of them we walked over just outside the torpedo room, as I showed you, that hatch that looked like a vent, we could see down through it. And there's another one right here behind this door, right, with the submarine on it. So this used to connect with this dry storeroom back here, but they're actually separated now by a bulkhead, essentially. In fact, I'll open this up and show you what's inside of it. We're not using it for anything except for just storage. It's basically the broom closet, essentially, but it goes further back and further aft back there. So again, those two rooms used to connect. So that's all that's in there currently. And same thing with the freezers as well. They're just storing stuff now. Some people want to look inside the freezers. Well, what's in the freezer? Like, nothing. We're just storing equipment in there. So, I mean, it's just a freezer. What do you want to know about it? Now, things that require cooler temperatures, but not necessarily refrigeration, like produce, eggs, and cheese, we're going to store them forward up there in the torpedo room. It's heavily air conditioned in there because there's explosives, but underwater it would actually be about 15 to 20 degrees colder. So it makes a halfway decent refrigerator. Furthermore, we know that nobody's using the showers anyway, so we're going to store the potatoes, the carrots, and youngins in there as well. This means you first need to get permission to shower, then you pull that food out of there, take your 1-minute shower, you wipe the shower stall completely dry with your towel, and you put that food back in the exact order that you found it in there. That'll take you longer than it did to take the actual shower, so have fun. And yet another reason why the showers weren't common on these submarines. Things that can withstand high temperatures like rice, coffee, tea, flour, sugar, etc., they're gonna go back there in the engine room because they can withstand the heat. After that, we're gonna start getting creative. So these benches here are actually hollow. We can put food in them if there's space. We'll store food underneath the tables, and we're even gonna store food up here in the ventilation system. Now, as we've established, your height doesn't really matter, so whether or not you're taller or shorter than 6'2", congratulations, you've just created a storage space. You're gonna be curling up your legs and sleeping with some food in your bunk. So we will literally stick food anywhere there is space. Any horizontal space is gonna have food. Right over here is the milk machine, the mechanical cow here. We have fresh milk on the submarine for maybe a week, then it becomes powdered and it tastes like chalk. I've also heard stories from the cooks on submarines hoarding the fresh milk so they can use it for the baking, and they put powdered milk in the machine shortly after getting underway. Nowadays, I think submarines actually carry a shelf-stable milk which can be kept at room temperature much longer, but sadly Blueback never had that stuff. Now all the fresh ingredients on the submarine will be eaten up in about a week or two, or otherwise they've spoiled. After that, the food comes frozen, dried, powdered, evaporated, or out of one of these number 10 cans. We're gonna take hundreds of these cans on board, and we have one place left to store them. We're gonna peel the labels off, write what's in them on top of them, and they're going down here on the deck. We're gonna line the whole deck of this submarine from torpedo room back to the engine room, port to starboard if necessary, lay down rubber mats over them, and we're gonna change the height of the rooms. 2 to 3 months at sea, we will double like this, or even triple stack the cans in places. Now me, I'm just 5'6", but remember the 6'8" guy. So you are literally going to memorize every single obstacle up here. If you can't figure out where this stuff is on your own, don't worry, the submarine will help you with that. So basically you're gonna be walking around the submarine like this, and you literally eat your way down to the deck. Now by the time your feet are touching the floor again, that's good news, because that means you're almost back to port. So it's basically an advent calendar. Now, the officers in the Navy will probably tell you that the most important machines on the entire submarine are like periscopes, torpedoes, or engines, but the average sailor disagrees. The 3 most important machines in the entire submarine are actually right here in this room. And it starts with this, the coffee maker. Do not leave home without this. The entire military, especially sailors, run on it. Now, documentation on the boat tells us that this bun was not original. Rather, it was actually a big 5-gallon coffee urn. So if you're the crank working in the scullery, you better be keeping this thing filled up. Another reason that coffee is so important, I've been told, especially on a diesel-electric submarine like Blueback, is that once we go underwater, we have no ability to generate fresh oxygen, as I mentioned. So the CO2 levels are going to start building up, and you're going to get more and more sleepy. A sleepy submariner is a dangerous submariner, so extra strong coffee is always available to keep you awake. And as we say, the most dangerous thing on any naval vessel is not fires or flooding or even the enemy, it's a chief without their coffee. If they don't have a coffee cup in their hands, then steer clear because they are going to be grumpy. Also, the chief's coffee cups will develop a nice little stain of dried coffee around them because they never wash them. Do not attempt to wash a chief's coffee cup. Now, the second most important machine is right here. This is not Jell-O, even though it's not moving. This is actually freshly squeezed, all natural bug juice. So when the sailors are ashore, they have to gather up a bunch of bugs and they bring them back. They squeeze out the juices in them into here. You know, the spiders and the cockroaches, the beetles, the scorpions and all that. No, don't worry. There's no actual bugs in here. This is what the Sea Service refers to as Gatorade or Kool-Aid, but it's not really. What this is basically water, vitamins, minerals, food coloring, and a whole lot of sugar. Now this comes in 5 delicious colors, none of which have any bearing on its flavor. It all tastes the same, it's just sweet, like diabetes essentially. But you're gonna have to drink this every week so you don't get a vitamin deficiency like scurvy. You need your vitamin C, right? And it has vitamin D as well because we don't see the sun either. Now the best thing about bug juice is not the flavor or the color, never mind that. It's when you leave out the sugar, there's so much ascorbic acid or vitamin C that you can actually use this stuff to polish brass, you can scrub the decks, or even clean the head with it. Yes, it is literally an all-purpose cleaner. I'm not joking. Now, one sailor who served on a Los Angeles-class submarine said that on his boat, the bug juice machine was in fact replaced with a slushy machine. That being said, he also told me that it did nothing whatsoever to change the flavor. All it did was change the texture. But apparently it actually worked because more of the guys were actually drinking the stuff. So yeah, whatever you need to do to get your vitamins. And no kids, you cannot drink this. This is a museum exhibit. It's just water, bleach, and food coloring now. Now the third and probably most important machine on the entire submarine is right here. This white-handled brown box. Yes, that is a soft serve ice cream machine. You can have as much ice cream as you want 24 hours a day, any flavor you want, as long as you use your imagination because they all look and taste like vanilla. Now yes, as I mentioned, there'd be condiments in the trays back here, so you'd have like chocolate syrups, you'd have nuts and maraschino cherries and stuff like that, sprinkles to put on top of your ice cream, but at the end of the day, it's still just vanilla soft serve. Now this machine, or God forbid, the coffee machine is broken, then there's gonna be like 10 guys in this room who've just decided they've become mechanics, and they're gonna try and fix them. If they are not successful though, then the captain will literally turn the submarine around or there's gonna be a mutiny. Now that said, one sailor who served on USS Permit said that the ice cream machine on his boat hardly ever worked. And I've also heard another story from a sailor who served on an attack sub. He said as they were leaving port, their ice cream machine broke down, and luckily they were able to get a new one, but they couldn't fit it through the hatch to get it onto the submarine, so they had to open up the casing, remove the innards of it, and they cut the casing into thirds, and they welded it back together onto the submarine and reassembled it. So the whole thing looked like some kind of Frankenstein machine. But yeah, they had their ice cream machine before they left on patrol. Now, one sailor who served aboard USS Memphis in the early 2000s told us that about halfway through the patrol, they would actually break out about 30 gallons of vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry hard pack ice cream, you know, like the kind you get in the big cartons at the store, and that would be like a treat for the sailors. Now, as I said, this room is also used for entertainment, so we have a nice 8-track player and stereo system up here, right? Brand new, right? And furthermore, that TV there with the VCR is also a brand new piece of equipment. It has clarity like you wouldn't believe, and it was actually in color. But that, along with the microwave right over there, are brand new pieces of equipment on the submarine. They did not exist for the first 20 years this submarine was in service. So instead, on Saturday nights, they would hang a screen between the two hooks right up there, and they'd fire up the old 16mm reel-to-reel movie projector. We have some of the film reels back here, right? They come in the boxes like that. So based on the size of those things, you're gonna have about 10 to 12 movies on board, so you get very familiar with them after a while. Now, a good movie will have like 30 to 40 guys shoved in this room. They're gonna make a big batch of popcorn and watch a movie in here, but this does not happen often. Eventually, you'll just get to the point where you'll get so familiar with the movies because you're watching them again and again and again. You eventually just turn off the sound and have the sailors say the lines. You can assign a different character to every sailor, run the movie forwards and backwards, or they'll just make up their own dialogue. But I'll leave it up to your imagination as about what they were saying. I'm not gonna repeat any of it here. Now later on though, we moved in the VCR, so we can watch more movies in VHS. Nowadays there's like DVDs and Blu-rays, and maybe someone brought like a hard drive with movies on it. Further back here in this cabinet is actually Blueback's library. So there'll be a bunch of books shoved in there as well that you can read. Now, all of the entertainment in here and the ice cream machine as well are reserved for those who are qualified and have their dolphins. If you are still a nub or a non-qual, then you do not get to watch movies. You do not get to eat ice cream. Instead, you better be studying. If you're in here reading a book for pleasure, someone's gonna snatch that book out of your hands and put a technical manual in your hands because that's what you need to be working on. Now, maybe if you're doing really, really good on your quals and you're making good progress, then someone might let you eat some ice cream, but they better be in here watching you eat it so they can vouch for you. Now, as we leave, you note that right here is a vertical ladder on the other side of the panel here. This is, like I said, the original entrance of the submarine. This panel lifts up where we were, leads up to officer country, and about 19 or 20 feet up there, you're gonna reach the topside deck. This is where it ends. When the submarine is in port, before they leave, all the crew and all the food comes down this ladder. So they just form a big, long, basically bucket brigade, pass one thing to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, and eventually it comes down this ladder and ends up on the submarine. As we leave here, as I said, this is actually one of the former dry stores on the submarine. Now, it has a radiation symbol on this because back in, I think it was the 80s, Admiral Hyman Rickover put an experimental reactor on the submarine, and it was stored in here, actually. It was operating here, and no, I'm just kidding. No, that never happened. We actually used to do a haunted submarine, and the theme was radioactive zombies, so we would crack open this door, and there'd be like a strobe light in there, and that was our leaking reactor, right? That was creating radioactive zombies for us. So that's why that's there. But again, it's literally just a dry store, and we're using it for storage right now. Okay, folks, well, we have now entered the engineering spaces on the submarine. Mind you that I'm not an engineer, a mechanic, or an electrician, so my lack of knowledge about this stuff is about to become very evident. But over here, On the starboard side, we have what used to be the machine shop, and there used to be actually a lathe here on this workbench for simple fabrication. Behind it, those large vertical steel cylinders are the hydraulic accumulators, 3 of them for the main, vital, and external hydraulic plants. And there's another one further back in the submarine as well. And over here, these kind of funky looking cylinders are purifiers, oil purifiers specifically. This one here is for the fuel oil. This one here is for the lube oil, and this one here will be used on standby for either lube oil or fuel oil. So some of the fuel will be stored in ballast tanks, and it floats on top of the water, so it has to go through this centrifuge to clean out any seawater or impurities. It's then pumped from a normal fuel oil tank into a clean fuel oil tank before it's injected into the engines themselves. Now further back port side over there are 2 air compressors for the AC system on the submarine. And there's actually another one over there, you can't really see it very well, but that's for the refrigeration system. Now also kind of hard to see this big large pipe right there, that white thing. Might be able to see it up here. Kind of right back there, yeah. So that large white pipe is actually the air induction, the main air induction. That's where all the air for the submarine comes in from the snorkel. And it ends actually down below. If you head down that hatch, it's down below in the engine room bilge. So you can literally stand underneath the opening of the air induction down there, and you will feel the air coming in to the submarine when the engines run, because they're sucking air into the boat. Now some of the air is used for the diesel engines to run, some of it is for the crew to breathe, and some goes through air compressors and gets stored in the air banks. Now right up here on the upper engine flat is one of our 3 diesel engines. Yes, that's what these big blue things are. These are Fairbanks Morse 38D 8 and 1/8 diesel engines. These have been in continuous production since they were developed in 1938. Versions of it are still in production today. They're a bit more efficient now, and they're still used today as stationary power generators, like at hospitals, and they're also used on nuclear-powered submarines like the LA, Seawolf, and Ohio-class submarines as backup generators. They're also used on a variety of surface ships like destroyer escorts and the Hamilton-class Coast Guard cutters as well. In fact, they were even used on train locomotives for a number of years. From my understanding, though, Fairbanks Morse exited the locomotive business after about 20 years because these engines don't really do very well at high altitudes or in very dry and hot environments that locomotives will sometimes find themselves in. Now these particular models are 8-cylinder, 16 opposed piston engines. The cylinder bore is 8 1/8 inch and they have a stroke of 10 inches. So what happens is, you see here in this diagram, the pistons come together, they form the combustion chamber, ignite the fuel, and they move outwards, up and down. So they turn crankshafts at the top and the bottom. So despite what some people think, the engines are not mounted upside down. That's literally how it looks. So what you're seeing is the top crankshaft. It's a 2-stroke design, and the lower crankshaft on these engines turns a 500-volt DC generator, which is down below the deck here. Up here we have all this various ducting here. This is the air intake for the engines. It comes down through this duct, goes through the scavenging air blower here, gets compressed and pushed into the engines itself. So the engines themselves are actually turned over with compressed air to start them. Furthermore, right here we have one of the 3D printed models of one of the actual pistons in the engine and its connecting rod. This is actual size. So we were actually debating about pulling one of these things out of the engines itself, but the thing is, the whole thing weighs like 170 pounds. And one volunteer said, you know, it would just be easier for him to 3D print it, so that's what he did. Now there are 3 diesel engines on Blueback. Number 1 engine here is on the starboard side. Number 3 engine here is on the port side. So where's number 2? It's down below the deck. So let me go over here, I'll lift up this hatch and I can show you where it is. That's the lower engine flat. Number 2 engine is centerline right down there. So over here we have a locker that would store some engine parts, particularly gaskets. And this piston here is not actually from the engine itself. That is an aluminum piston. It's actually for a high pack, a high pressure air compressor. You would not put this thing into a diesel engine. It would not survive. Now, the diesel engines are only run when the submarine is on the surface or when it's snorkeling. Now, we normally play a sound in here to kind of simulate what the sound of the engine's running, but if they were running for real, then this room would literally be around 137 decibels and 125 degrees Fahrenheit or more. So you would literally need to wear rubber earplugs in addition to your Mickey Mouse earmuffs here, or you would literally have permanent hearing damage in 30 minutes. Now forward up here, above the machine shop and the AC systems and all that, is the engine mezzanine. In the back there, you can't really see it very well, but there is a large air compressor for the Prairie Masker system. Prairie itself is an acronym for Propeller Air-Induced Emission, and this was meant to reduce the noise of cavitation, which was created as the screw turns through the water and creates bubbles that implode as they move from a low pressure to a high pressure area behind the screw. This occurs at certain depths and at certain speeds. So compressed air is pumped through tiny holes on the edges of the propeller blade to reduce the noise of cavitation. The masker part of the system is that when the sub is snorkeling, it's running its diesel engines, and this creates a huge amount of noise. So compressed air from the air compressor is also emitted through several bands around the hull of the submarine, which creates effectively a curtain of bubbles around the sub to reflect the noise from the engines back to the submarine itself, again reducing its noise signature. So the idea with the Prairie Masker system was to reduce cavitation and noise from a snorkeling submarine's engines. The system kind of worked from my understanding, but reportedly it was a maintenance nightmare. Now in theory, it was supposed to sound sort of like a rain squall on the surface to a listening sonar technician, but the problem was that they could still blade count, and this rain squall supposedly was covering such a narrow area and moving in such a particular direction that it was clearly not natural. But that was the idea anyway. By the 1980s, the system had been removed from these submarines. As Rick Nolt told me, he said when he got aboard Bonefish in 1984, it did not have the Prairie Masker system. And furthermore, when he got aboard Blueback later on, it didn't have the system either. Just, a couple of things of it left. Although I think some surface ships like the Ticonderoga guided missile cruisers and the Oliver Hazard Perry frigates still have them. Now also up here, those kind of funny looking gray things, that is one of the 3 60-cycle 75 kVA motor generator sets, and above it up there is one of the 400-cycle 25 kVA motor generator sets. And here is the second of the 75 kVA generator sets. Now further back here, we have the 2 freshwater stills on the submarine. As I said earlier, each of these stills is theoretically capable of making about 1,000 gallons of fresh water a day, assuming all the stars and planets align and you're running these things 24 hours a day. And there are blowers above them which lower the air pressure, which in turn lowers the boiling point of the water, if you remember your physics. So they collect the condensation, which is fresh because the salt in the water does not vaporize below boiling point. Directly below them is actually a distillate tank to collect the water, along with other things down there underneath this deck, like the trim pump and one of the seawater service pumps. Up this ladder back here is the aft escape trunk. It's the same as the one in the torpedo room, the forward escape trunk, except you would not load torpedoes through the aft escape trunk here. But it's the same thing essentially. All right, this is the maneuvering room. Everything that deals with generating electricity and controlling propulsion, that is, making the submarine go forwards and backwards and fast and slow, are controlled from this room. Now, the only thing the diesel engines in the engine room do is turn 3 940 kilowatt, 1500 amp generators that produce power and charge the batteries on the submarine. All the power, either from the batteries or the generators, goes through the battery bus and gets directed into the electric propulsion motor behind the bulkhead here, and that's what powers the submarine. There are actually 2 electric motors back there shoved end to end, so many publications show the Barbel subs as having 2 electric motors, and technically they do, but they just visually appear as one. And together, the electric motors produce a total of about 6,440 shaft horsepower. So back there, that's what actually is turning the screw. Essentially, the entire submarine is running on electricity. Now, there's no direct linkage between the diesel engines and the propeller shaft. The US Navy started using indirect diesel drive for submarines around 1935. It's a more flexible system, albeit heavier and a bit more complex than direct drive, but it does allow the diesels to be run at optimum speed. So the diesel engines can be run in any configuration that they want. For example, they can run 1 or 2 of them and keep the third one shut down if it needs maintenance or it's being held up in reserve. Now normally 3 men would be in this room at any given time. So this right here is the engine control panel. The engine man has 3 identical sets of controls for monitoring, starting, and stopping the 3 diesel engines. Above it here is another hull opening indicator panel for the air induction and exhaust as well for the hull and the snorkel. Now one funny instrument right here is there's an altimeter. Why on earth would a submarine be concerned with its altitude? It's not an airplane after all. And the altimeter is not measuring how high the submarine goes when it does an emergency blow and comes out of the water. And furthermore, it's not going in reverse or whatever and measuring our depth either. Well, here's the thing. It's measuring barometric air pressure. If we're snorkeling and a wave washes over the air induction, there's a head valve in the snorkel that will shut to prevent water going down the snorkel. And this means instead of now drawing air from the atmosphere, the engines are now sucking air from inside the submarine. They'll get it from wherever they can. So if we see the air pressure on the altimeter rapidly decrease and this thing starts spinning wildly, then that's a cue for the engine man to hit the emergency stop there and immediately shut down those engines. Now the diesel engines will basically suck the air out of this boat in roughly 5 or 6 minutes, and we'd all suffocate unless you turn off them immediately when the snorkel shuts. Back here we have the propulsion control console. This panel here on the left with all the gauges is for the junior controllerman who monitors the batteries. He controls the field, that is the amperage on the 3 generators with these kind of 3 gray knobs right here. And below it he has controls for the actual speed of the engines themselves. Now next to him here will be the senior controllerman, who would probably also be the engineering watch supervisor. He would control the actual speed of the electric motors. Now in the control room, they're only concerned with steering and navigation. Propulsion is controlled from here. They signal here from the control room on the motor order telegraph right there, and you have to match up the red arrow with the black arrow, which is known as answering bells. If needed, they can also call down into this room on these sound-powered phones down here, or on this intercom up here, and they can tell them specifically how fast they want to go. So in submarine movies, you might hear them call down from control saying something like, "Maneuvering, con, make turns for 4 knots, let's say." And they answer back down here, "Make turns for 4 knots, con, maneuvering, aye, sir." So they just acknowledge the orders, and they work on this equipment down here to change the speed of the submarine. Now fine control of the speed here is done on this rheostat right here. So you can see it's changing, raising or decreasing the speed and changing the main motor field. So that's actually fine control of the speed right there. Rough control of the speed is done from this left-hand wheel right here, this chrome wheel, known as the setup hand wheel. What this wheel does is it lines up the 2 battery compartments, not the cells themselves, but the battery compartments and the 2 electric motors into either series or parallel, and therefore it increases or decreases the voltage and therefore the speed of the electric motors. Now forward and backward control of the shaft is normally done from this black knob right here. You can see it says stop, it says ahead and back. So that was normally how forward and backward is controlled on the propeller shaft. Otherwise, down there, this right-hand chrome wheel is the startup hand wheel, which they would use for controlling the forward and backward motion. So what this does here is it changes the polarity of the armatures in the electric motor and therefore changes the direction of the shaft itself. Now the top speed of Blueback underwater was roughly 21 knots, or about 24 miles per hour, but that would actually drain the batteries in about 35 minutes. Conversely, if they slow down to about 4 knots or 5 miles an hour, then those batteries will last about 105 hours, a bit over 4 days. Now usually every 2 to 3 days, or even every night if they needed, they would bring the submarine up to about 60 feet, raise the snorkel so it's in the air, light off the diesel engines, recharge the batteries, and refresh the air on the submarine. Reportedly, it would take anywhere from about 6 to 12 hours to recharge the batteries, depending on how discharged they are. In terms of fuel capacity, the Blueback could carry about 112,000 gallons of diesel fuel. This gives her a range of anywhere from about 15,000 to 19,000 nautical miles before needing to refuel. Our examination of her deck logs calculates out that she has an average fuel economy of roughly 0.07 nautical miles per gallon, or about 13.5 gallons per nautical mile. So yeah, not miles per gallon, gallons per mile. Stick with your car. Now nuclear-powered submarines don't have to worry about that. They make their own oxygen with electrolysis, and the reactor has enough energy to power the submarine for over 30 years. Their only limitation is how much food and toilet paper they can carry. Now last few things I'll talk about in this room are These gray cabinets here, some people wonder what they are. This forward one right here is the starboard side 60 cycle switchboard for AC power on the boat. This controls the 75 kVA sets, and the power can be directed through the circuit breakers on the bottom there. And just next to it here, aft, is the 400 cycle AC switchboard for the 25 kVA sets. On the other side of the room over here is the port side 60 cycle AC switchboard, and next to it over here on this wall are the controls for the distillers, the drain pumps, seawater pumps, and the 2 high pressure air compressors for starting and stopping them right there. Now directly below this room is actually the pump room. It's about the size of a closet. It contains the 2 high pressure air compressors, drain pump, and another seawater service pump. So these are for the air and drain systems on the submarine. And similarly, people ask, like, what are these, like, wheels up here? These are valves. Every valve is color coded. These dark green valves are seawater valves, so these are for the trim and drain system here as well. And again, you can see another EAB manifold up there as well. In fact, let me open up this hatch here. I can show you what it looks like down in the pump room. That's it. I had to crawl down in that room actually the other week to change a light bulb because I'm small and I can easily fit through this hatch and get down this ladder. It was a slow day. I had to find something to do. On either side here is what's known as shaft alley, or the auxiliary machinery space. I'm going to go down starboard side here. I'll show you a little bit about what's back here. So this here is part of the electric motor, which extends further down below the deck here that I'm standing on. Here's the 4th hydraulic accumulator in here. And right here we have the 3rd 75 kVA generator aft of it. In the very back of the submarine here, this is the 29-foot long, 12.5-inch diameter propeller shaft. It exits the hull through the shaft seal to where the propeller will be on the back of the submarine. This is designed to turn at about 230 RPMs at 7,780 shaft horsepower and 162 RPMs at 3,150 shaft horsepower. Now the propeller shaft itself is acting on this. This is the thrust bearing. So this is what actually pushes the submarine and makes it go forward. If this thrust bearing were not here, the shaft would essentially shove itself right through the electric motor. Obviously, that would be a bit of a problem. On the center line up here, you see a silver cylinder here. This is the hydraulic cylinder for the stern planes. Now, if we look down port side here, we can see the other hydraulic cylinder way back there, that white thing, which is for the rudder. And furthermore, these things right here, which a lot of people confuse for the batteries, are not batteries. They're shunt resistors for the electric motor. I should also mention that further back, aft in the submarine, in the shaft alley there, it's actually on this side, the port side, is one of the 2 signal ejectors. There's one back there, there's the other one forward in the torpedo room. So I think it's a 3-inch signal ejector. It can be used for ejecting acoustic decoys for torpedoes coming at you. They can fire off pyrotechnics and flares from those as well. So that's where they would shoot the decoys or pyrotechnics out as well. All right, folks, well, that about does it for the engineering spaces on the submarines. We're gonna head back out here. If anybody wants to know more about the technical details of the submarine, I could also recommend technical tours. Those are specifically guided by submarine veterans. One of them, Rick Nolt, is a former Blueback crewman. So for about 3 or 4 hours, depending on the questions asked, they will take you through the whole submarine, tell you anything you want to know in excruciating detail. But you gotta make sure to book early for those because they're limited to 6 people per tour, and you have to be 12 or older to be on them. So, like months in advance, they fill it fast. All right, now lastly, up these stairs, these exit stairs, is the blue step. that is actually the water line of the river outside. That's where we put it. It's about 8.5 feet from the deck here up to the water line. So we have actually been completely underwater since we came down that ladder from the control room back there. Now, as always, if you're ever in the Portland area, come on down to OMSI, buy a ticket for a submarine tour. We'll be glad to show you the place. You'll be able to see, touch, and smell the real submarine. All right, so let me discuss a little bit about this. Now, when visitors come down to the Blueback, they actually pass by this propeller. This is the actual screw from the submarine. It was removed from the submarine down there and placed up here because it is currently a memorial for submarines that have been lost in service. Now, the bricks around the base of this screw have the names and dates of submarines that never made it back home from patrol, starting with the F4 right there and ending with USS Scorpion right there in 1968, which was the last submarine the US Navy ever lost. In fact, since World War II, the US Navy has only lost 4 submarines, being the Cochino, the Stickleback, the Thresher, and the Scorpion. Another thing is that back here, let's see, according to this brick, there's actually a time capsule beneath this propeller. It's going to be opened sometime around 24 August 2050. And no, I have no clue what is in this time capsule. I presume it's like underneath it there or something. Now, talking about the screw itself, it's about 12.5 feet in diameter and weighs about 11,000 pounds. It's manganese, aluminum, nickel, and bronze. Now, I also mentioned that there is a system on this submarine called Prairie Masker. So if we look on the edges of the propeller, you see these teeny tiny little holes. So now the idea with the Prairie Masker system is that Prairie stands for propeller air-induced emission. There's a big air compressor inside the submarine that when the submarine is snorkeling, it compresses air, pumps it through various pipes in the submarine, and some of the air is coming out of those holes in the propeller. The idea was to reduce the noise of cavitation on the screw. Now, cavitation is essentially a function of depth, speed, and temperature of the water. So the faster a screw turns to the water, the closer it is to the surface and, at the correct temperature, it forms an area of low pressure. And again, if you remember your physics, when you lower the pressure of a liquid, you lower the boiling point of it. Essentially, the water is boiling itself when the propeller turns to the water, and the water vapor bubbles, when they move into an area of high pressure behind the propeller, they will implode and create a lot of noise. And furthermore, these imploding water bubbles can actually damage and erode a propeller over time. Now, the idea with the Prairie system is that the air coming out of the holes around the edges of the propeller blade means that the water vapor, when they implode, has some air inside of it, so it doesn't create as much noise. So that was essentially the idea, to reduce the noise of cavitation coming off the screw there. Now, the utility of it was kind of debatable. For example, a sonar technician could hear a system that was using Prairie Masker, and they would still be able to, basically count the RPMs, the blade rate on the screw. They can classify the contact, whether it's like a submarine, a merchant ship, or a destroyer or something. And additionally, the idea was that the sound of the Prairie Masker system was meant to sound something like a rain squall, but it was covering such a narrow band, like a couple of degrees, when an actual rain squall might cover something like 20 degrees. And it's moving in a really specific direction at a specific speed, so it obviously was not a rain squall, but that was the idea. The whole Prairie Masker system itself was also a maintenance nightmare from my understanding. And again, by the end of her service, Blueback no longer had it, but she only has components of it left right now. Now, another thing to note about US submarines is that they would possess screws with an odd number of blades. So as you see here, this is a 5-bladed screw. Furthermore, when Blueback was in service, the actual shape and design of the screw would have been highly classified. So whenever submarines went to dry dock, they would actually cover up the propeller itself so people couldn't take pictures of it and see what it looked like, because based on the pictures of it, you can determine perhaps the acoustic profile of that screw. Now, modern day submarines use pump jet propulsors, starting with the Seawolf class and moving on to the Virginias and eventually the Columbia class. So they have this big shroud over the pump jet, so there's no traditional propeller like you would see here. So furthermore, pump jets are much quieter than these screws. But again, the design of these things was heavily classified at the time. Now, another thing I've been told by former sonar technicians is that Soviet submarines, the way you can tell is because they had even numbers of blades on their propellers, and as a result, when they were turning through the water, it tended to create this sort of thumping noise. It wasn't necessarily loud, they told me, but it was noticeable. Yeah, that's one way you can tell. It's like, oh, there's a thumping noise. It's got an even number of blades when they do a blade count. So yep, it's a Soviet ship or something, or a submarine, not an American one. So the actual design of the propellers produced by Americans for their submarines was meant to be very efficient and extremely quiet. US submarines, for a long period of time during the Cold War, had a leading edge against Soviet submarines because they were quieter. Not necessarily faster, but quieter, which arguably is what really counts on submarines.